Okay, anybody who says they didn't like that is banned. All right. We are joined once again by Haz from Infrared and Lewis from Perspective Philosophy to debate veganism. A quick reminder about format and rules. Opening statements are 8 minutes long. Who goes first will be determined by a coin toss. I will warn you when you hit 5 minutes so you can wrap up, because when you hit 8, I will cut you dead. This will be followed by 2 sets of alternating 5-minute responses, followed by 45 minutes of open discussion, and concluding with 20 minutes for question period.
Hold on. Do you think it'd be better if we just do like a full open discussion?
I think have open statements and then we can
I do insist on opening statements and at least one exchange of arguments. Otherwise, it just becomes a shit show from go.
Okay, fine.
Yeah, but I'm happy to cut it short by 1 5 minutes.
If it's any consideration, I haven't had a chance to prepare. I got in I thought that we were starting at 10:30, so I thought I was late. So I have had no chance to prepare. So like my streams watched me trying to type shit down just to try and like
yeah, no worries. And for whatever reason, I thought we were early, so just
all right, so we are actually. Oh, so I was actually late. Okay.
Yeah, you were. Unfortunately,
that sounds about right.
All right, so this will be followed by one set of alternating 5-minute responses, followed by endless open discussion. And when we hit, let's say, 2.5 hours in, we'll end with audience questions for about 20 minutes. If you have questions, you need to ask them in my chat. I ask that you mark them with an asterisk so I can find them. Rules of conduct are strict. Speaking out of turn will result in 30 more seconds of speaking time being allotted to the other party. Doesn't really matter because we're going straight into open discussion. The use of slurs or personal abuse will be met with an immediate ban, and this applies both to the audience and to our debaters. If either participant attempts to talk over or challenge the moderator, being myself, during this debate, they will first be muted and warned, then removed. I trust all this has been made clear, and that by participating, both guests have tacitly agreed to the rules as just laid out. With that out of the way, we will flip a coin to see who goes first for opening statements. Lewis, your heads. Taz, your tails. Tails. Haz, you go first. You have 8 minutes.
Sure, yeah. So I didn't actually prepare an 8-minute opening statement, but I think there's a few things that I think I want to cover here that I wasn't able to cover last time because I was too tired. So the first thing in order is that I made actually a big mistake during the last debate because I made a confusion. I made a conflation, and I was overthinking it too much. So when I conceded that animals... Thank you, Shin E, for the raid. Appreciate it. Sorry about that. When I conceded that animals are in fact conscious, for some reason I was confused, and I thought that what he was trying to say is that for Hegel, animals are attributed with a degree of not a degree. They are attributed subjectivity and selfhood, and obviously that is the case in Hegel's philosophy of nature. The organism in general, not just plants, but also the earth and plants, have some kind of subjecthood in relation to their own generality. That's a completely different thing than subjectivity proper for, a speaking subject. So I confused that for some reason with consciousness, and I thought he was trying to say that by the criterion that there's some kind of similarity between the division between generality and individuality that Hegel establishes is uniquely the case for animals as opposed to plants with consciousness. And that was a big mistake on my part. As a matter of fact, within the very opening of Hegel's philosophy of nature, it becomes very clear that Hegel has a working distinction between nature and spirit, and that animals actually fall within the category, I guess is a loaded term philosophically, of nature. Animals do not participate in spirit proper, as far as Hegel is concerned. Now, one of the reasons why this was so confusing is because Hegel also makes it clear that the dialectical concept, which is interior and which emerges only in spirit, is the very thing that leads the stages of the philosophy of nature further. So, for example, beginning from mathematics to inorganic physics to organic physics, the thing leading these stages along is the very same dialectical concept, which emerges only in spirit. But that doesn't mean that it's the same thing as the domain and sphere of spirit proper. And I think one of the other reasons I had this confusion, because I was thinking more of the question of the implications this has in cosmological terms. Like, what does the implications of the emergence of spirit have for like a cosmology of spirit, which I guess is the work of Ilyenkov itself. Like, how is it that nature becomes the thinking consciousness? So I think I was being too generous with perspective philosophy and attributing him with a degree of depth that wasn't there. Because he wasn't talking about that. As a matter of fact, the stage of consciousness, if you can even call it a stage proper, within Hegel's phenomenology of mind, is only meaningful from the perspective of being an orientation, a path to absolute knowledge. Consciousness, and moreover self-consciousness and other stages, are, for Hegel, rather than necessarily existent stages within which different kinds of beings dwell, they are moments of the incomplete. They are moments of not only moments of absolute knowledge, but they are also incomplete perspectives on the question of absolute knowledge within the history of philosophy. And Hegel makes that very clear. Even the question of whether consciousness or self-consciousness exist as such is by no means clear in Hegel, rather than just being incomplete perspectives in history of philosophy. So this idea that Lewis was forwarding, like that, oh yeah, humans belong to the middle term of self-consciousness and animals belong to the term, it's a complete absurdity. Hegel makes it very clear, also in the philosophy of nature, of the sphere of humanity and the sphere of spirit coincide. It's one and the same sphere. Like, spirit begins with humanity. So consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit, etc., these are not things that you can, neatly box. These are not. This is not some kind of like cosmology within which humans only occupy one sphere. Humans are a part of every single sphere, every single one. The question, like, humans are not just the middle term, as Lewis was putting it. That's a complete ridiculous absurdity. Humans, humans. All of this phenomenology of mind is describing humanity proper. You can say
3
that.
minutes left.
Yeah, you could say that the different spheres represent like different relationship humanity has. Different relations, but to absolute knowledge, I mean, but ultimately it's all humanity. It's not just the so-called middle term. Maybe what he was trying to say is that self-consciousness is the extent of humanity as can be conceived of like as an individual, and moreover, not just an individual, but an unreflexive, like non-philosophical individual, like the kind of pre-moral individual of Kant. Even then, that would be very wishy-washy and very ambiguous. So, let me think. Is there anything else I wanted to get to? Since I have 3 minutes, I can think about it. Yeah, in general, I just think Lewis doesn't have any real grasp of Hegelian philosophy. I think he's deeply confused about what he's talking about. I think I'll just conclude it there.
Thank you very much. And Lewis, you're going to get 8 minutes, starting now.
Right, that's great. I hope you can all hear us. So yeah, I think it's quite funny in some respects to kind of double back on saying that animals are conscious, considering Hegel himself actually says animals are conscious in the phenomenology of spirit. He actually says, I'll find the quote if you like. He says, what is it? Where is it? As sentient I am myself, external, spatial, and temporal, as receptive of sensuous intuitions, I receive them from something which is external to itself. An animal can intuit, but the soul of an animal has for its object not its soul itself, but something external. He does not say that animals are soulless, without consciousness, who don't intuit the world. No, they don't intuit themselves. That is the separation, which is why they never make it to the middle term within the dialectical process, which I thought, I was hoping you were starting to understand. But that's essentially the positive notion being represented against nature. And this is where we start producing determinate objects and identities from which then we can make meaning and sense of nature and not take it at its infinite form, which seems to prevent any knowledge of nature itself. But, you know, like that's essentially the Hegelian dialectic, which reconciles absolute knowing in the sense of the, well, actually, I mean, like, let's pull up another quote. Like, it is fundamentally the truth of consciousness which is being reconciled within spirit. Spirit has shown itself as the unity of soul and consciousness, the former a simple immediate totality, and the latter knowledge, which is not limited by any object and no longer stands in relation to it, but its knowledge of the simple, neither subjective nor objective totality. Spirit originates, therefore, not only from its own being and relates itself to its own determinations. So spirit is related only to itself, which has annihilated the mediation of self-consciousness in consciousness. Consciousness as spirit no longer needs self-consciousness. It takes reality as it is. It no longer has to propose determinate objects. For example, humanity. That's unbelievably clear. I mean, in the science of logic, he says, a beginning is logical in that it is made to be the element of a free self-contained thought. In pure knowledge, it is mediated. For pure knowledge is the ultimate and absolute truth of consciousness. Like, I mean, I don't know how many times I have to say this, and he does say that animals are conscious. He just says that animals don't will themselves, so cannot own themselves. He basically says they are conscious, but can't, contain their own, own their own spirit. That's just essentially that they're not self-conscious. They're incapable of ethics. So they're not able to sign contracts, which I don't think many of us would disagree with. But his inability to reconcile consciousness and self-consciousness because of his own ideology is exactly what we need to talk about. So now that that's out the way, let's move on to really what we need to consider within this conversation, which is that previously I outlined the ontological commitments of Hegel as consciousness, and that these commitments also have an epistemological grounding in which self-consciousness must reconcile itself with consciousness as a reflexive process, intellective, purely reflexive on the sensuous data that it receives from conscious experience. Without such data, it would be meaningless. The experience in the world is what grounds self-consciousness. Knowledge is not knowledge abstract, but knowledge of ourselves, which would, without which, when we pose something like an abstract notion of a rational man, we reduce the notion of God in Hegelian philosophy to that of a calculator, or worse still, a Kantian. The idealization of man has been tested, and it has resoundingly failed. The Hegelian position stands to reconcile the unity of consciousness and the self. This attempt to move us towards an abstract one-sidedness is in and of itself a notion of either an unhappy consciousness or an attempt to express one's consumption out of fear of meaninglessness. So we're either trying to consume meaninglessly, rather, or we are trying to escape that meaninglessness through an abstract notion. So you can either pick. You're either someone who consumes animals because you like the taste of them and you're scared of giving up your favorite foods, or you do it because you have some sort of supreme anthropocentric notion. You're a Christian, you're a Muslim, or something like that. This stands really as a dominant ideology, one which I would name carnism, one that sees that meat.
3 minutes left.
Thank you. One that sees meat consumption as natural, normal, and necessary. One which places the object of man as a sublime object of ideology from which we are supposed to see the world through, where its name could only be said to be Adam. We must seek to disavow this ideology or this abstract notion and instead reconcile ourselves with consciousness. We need to confront the monstrosity that we see in the eyes of the animals and our own death drives as recognizing ourselves as committing an action of evil and injustice, and reconcile ourselves with our own self-destruction. So what must happen next is our active reconciliation with consciousness itself. The movement to consider the life and liberty of all sentient beings and reject abstract notions of right and unjustified modes of consumption. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Haz, you're going to have 5 minutes to respond.
So, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I have a fucking technical complication right now. My mic just got unplugged.
Okay, well
And
we
I'm
can
trying
hear
to-
you on my end.
Yeah, I'm trying. I gotta fix my stream though. I gotta.
Okay,
fix
no
my
worries. Take your time.
properties default. Hold on. Okay, I think I got it fixed. I got it fixed. Okay, we're
Perfect. All right, 5 minutes.
Okay, let me just go. We got 5 minutes.
You got 5 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Lewis, Hegel does not say that animals are conscious. You literally just pulled that out of your ass. The relevant passage you just described proves that animals could not possibly be conscious because consciousness takes as its premise the very subject-object distinction, which animals are not capable of having. Consciousness, Lewis, is not simply is not simply like the ability to intuit, the ability to have intuitions or whatever. Consciousness specifically refers to these what an object is for another, for someone. For Hegel, it's very clear that animals do not possess this, it's interesting, and also that you keep fucking dodging the point, which is like as clear as day. It is like so one-sidedly apparent. For Hegel, within the very philosophy of nature, you can read the first part of that philosophy of nature. Animals belong to the domain of nature. Humans belong to the domain of spirit. Hegel, like, there's no ambiguity whatsoever as far as that's concerned. Now, what you're trying to do is make it seem like consciousness is some kind of existent for Hegel, right? But in nowhere does Hegel say consciousness is an existent. Consciousness for Hegel represents an incomplete perspective as far as the quest for absolute knowledge is concerned. Hegel, for example, talks about the immediate consciousness, of sense certainty, right? And the whole thing that is driving this process along is the quest for absolute knowledge, okay? When Hegel talks about consciousness, he's talking about the inadequacy of consciousness to exhaust this. That's why for Hegel, there is actually a moment in which consciousness necessarily must become self-consciousness, okay? And this follows imminently. Hegel doesn't say consciousness becomes self-consciousness because of some biological mutation. Hegel says consciousness becomes self-consciousness because the attempt to arrive at the absolute knowledge by means of the immediate consciousness of objects in the world ultimately fails and becomes inadequate. So eventually, consciousness itself as selfhood must become such an object. And this is the stage for Hegel of self-consciousness. It is so fundamentally meaningless to say that animals are conscious because animals are not like caught in this quest for absolute knowledge whatsoever. So no. Then the second thing you said, that it's very clear for Hegel that you said a lot of word salad and a lot of mumbo jumbo about self-consciousness. Hegel, yeah, it's very clear that humans are the middle term. No, it's not clear whatsoever. Nowhere does Hegel state that humans are the so-called middle term. For Hegel, again, the phenomenology of spirit exhausts is all humanity. It's all humanity that's participating in all of these stages. It's all moments of humanity. Actually, the young Hegelians precisely interpreted it that way. They got rid of the element of God and were basically just saying that it's just a fundamentally human. Hegel was secretly just saying that this was all man, or as Marx said, the conclusion of German philosophy is that man is the highest essence for man. I mean, you can reject that perspective and say Hegel was really talking about God and so on and so on, but animals don't figure in it whatsoever. You're saying, yeah, consciousness isn't some kind of existent premise. Consciousness is a stage of inadequacy for Hegel and nothing more. Now, if you're talking about consciousness as the elementary moment of the subject-object distinction, then yeah, obviously consciousness has great importance for Hegel. But what consciousness actually is, so far as its essence is concerned, has to be taken at the end of his philosophy, not the beginning. He doesn't establish a dogmatic premise that he remains committed to the very end. What consciousness actually must necessarily be is at the end of the phenomenology of spirit, not the beginning. You said that is clear, but nowhere is I forgot. I don't know what you said. The so-called ontological commitment you're talking about consciousness is just wrong. You're talking out of your ass. Hegel describes the inadequacy of consciousness, and that's the whole point. I already said that. Now, you may oppose the so-called idealization of man as a failed enterprise or whatever, but Hegel recognizes humanity and man as the exclusive domain of spirit. It is literally meaningless, incomprehensible, and absurd to think that the animals can belong to the sphere of spirit.
All right, that's a good line to end on.
If you reject it, you're not a Hegelian. Okay, that's it.
We're on time. Yeah, sorry about that. And Lewis, 5 minutes.
He just doesn't reconcile them as like self-conscious, which I've provided evidence for because I actually quoted Hegel. The thing is that I think it's quite funny because you say that Hegel begins with the subject-object distinction. No, he begins with the immanent consciousness, which is the point of self-certainty, which is just existence itself. It's infinite, which is why he starts with the infinites, which I would like to ask you if you could name them. What are the three infinites that exist in Hegel? If you could outline what are the fundamental ontological tenets of reality. Which exist within which self-consciousness must reconcile, because they are what we begin with, which is the whole movement. Like if we already began with the subject-object distinction, the movement would have already started the dialectic too soon, which he criticizes other philosophers for doing. He starts the dialectic at the very beginning. What must be the case, and where can we reason from? So when you say that he actually presupposes like a dogmatic notion or something as the first term that he's not committed to, that's ridiculous. Hegel absolutely is committed to the movement of the dialectic. The terms prior were necessary, and we have imminently moved from them to complete the dialectical process, which is the reconciliation of the first term and the middle terms in spirit. It's the way reason works. Hegel's not like abstracting a new rational schemata where he's just totally revolutionizing the way people think. He's actually taking something which was proposed in many ways by Plato and Aristotle and renewing it for a modern time and showing how it actually develops over time. Like the notion of consciousness as its immanency is stagnant. The motion of the middle terms is self-consciousness and is infinite, and he says that as much. The infinite middle term, which is self-consciousness, and that is on I think on in the phenomenology of spirit an absolute right. The reality of the situation is, like, to say that the ontological commitments of Hegel are not to consciousness and purely self-consciousness totally misses the value of self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is to remove the negativity that exists, the purely negative motion that exists in consciousness, in which we are subject to all of the pains of nature and never actually able to express our drives. We're existing in a way that's purely impulsive, in a way that is damaging, and so seek to free ourselves. It is an imminent movement because we are in pain, and that pain drives us onwards. It's not that we have already started with the intellectual, like the introspective necessary conditions to work out what we must know, because that would be the Kantian position. That would be like, all right, well, we already have what we need to know everything about absolute knowledge and truth. And so we can just enter it into a calculator, into a boop, boop, categorical imperative. There we go. No, that's not how it works. The reality of the situation is that we are analyzing the drives that are being mediated through society. These drives are necessary for Hegel, and they exist in consciousness. And that's what society is mediating in terms of absolute right. At the point of absolute right, there is no confliction in the system of drives. Now, Hegel sees that as being purely anthropocentric. Of course he does. He was writing 300 years ago. It is absolutely odd when people were even non-racist 300 years ago. And you said yourself, Hegel is, fairly conservative as an individual. That's not surprising. But looking at Hegelian philosophy through the lens of what did Hegel think would be dogmatism and historicism. That's
1 minute
not
left.
how it works. You don't go, Hegel thought X, Y, and Z, and then seek to prove his conclusions, you take the Hegelian method, you take the ways in which he understood the world, and then you apply it to the problems that we have. And that is what contemporary Hegelians do, which is why we don't seem to be trying to promote some sort of monarchy for some reason. It's almost as if it had everything to do with him living in Prussia. Like, oh my God. Like, anyway, the whole point of this scenario is to reconcile that consciousness must reconcile itself with itself. That is the mandate in spirit. When spirit has done that, then spirit is free. Now, I've given you 4 quotes. I think was it 4 or 3 quotes explaining that. Now, I ask you the question: what are the 3 infinite tenets, which are the ontological foundations for Hegel? The 3 infinites in Hegel.
All right, thank you, and that's time. Okay, and by request, we're going to move into open discussion. For the audience, if you want to ask questions, I cannot see them unless they're in my chat. So you're going to have to come in here and put them into my chat. I ask that you put an asterisk on both sides of it so I can identify it quickly. And we'll try and go through as many as possible in the last 20 minutes. We're going to go for about an hour if we're both okay with that. Yeah, guys, take it away.
So, Lewis, I'm actually not going to entertain your little attempt to quiz me or whatever, because you're not the teacher in this scenario. You're my student, as proven by our actual.
Because you don't know, you're avoiding the question. Because
I don't. Okay, so you're randomly gonna quiz me on random bullshit.
Ask us the question on Hegel.
Establish
on Hegel.
Establish. Sunday, is guy he's allowed to interrupt me like this? Because I can interrupt too.
I'm not.
Lewis,
way more unpleasant than you, Lewis. We don't want to play this game, do you?
Here, guys.
Little boy, don't play this game with me, Lewis. Don't play these gorilla games with me, little boy. Lewis
has 10 seconds. Then Lewis, go.
Lewis, you failed to actually. I have to respond to a lot of the shit he said. I'm gonna only get 30 seconds.
You get 10 seconds until he's allowed to interrupt.
Okay, yeah, Lewis, you haven't fucking demonstrated the relevance of the 3 infinites according to Hegel as far as the actual point under contention was concerned. The point under contention being, you talked about the immanent, oh no, Hegel doesn't begin with the division of subject of object. Well, you're just fucking putting words in my mouth. What I'm trying to say is that consciousness, beginning with consciousness, immanent or otherwise, implies some kind of fundamental division between subject and object. There is no consciousness without that division. Now, I didn't say Hegel. My fucking point was Hegel doesn't establish a dogmatic premise that he maintains his commitment to. As far as the ontological commitment to consciousness is concerned, which is what we're beginning with, the actual content, the being of consciousness, is something that Hegel develops through the course of the phenomenology. You do not first establish the ontological significance of consciousness and then begin from there. That's not the nature of Hegel's thinking, and it's not his method, and it's not how his system worked. Now, your thing about Hegel lived 300 years ago. Yeah, but here's the difference. Hegel had a very rigorous distinction between nature and spirit, and he also had a rigorous description of what he considered animals and the way in which animals were different from humans. Nothing has changed to justify a difference as far as how you can reconcile Hegel's underlying method and his system with the others. You talk a lot of gibberish and word salad.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Yeah. Lewis, do you want to respond?
Well, I mean, to be entirely honest with you, I'm a little bit sad that you're not going to answer the question, because I think it is fundamentally important, since it is the ontology from which Hegel's building everything from. I mean, I can answer it if you like, but whatever. And if you want to ask me a question on Hegel, you're very welcome to be entirely honest with you. You can quiz us on whatever you want.
I think you're the one who needs education here.
Well, I'm happy to answer any question you like. But the thing is that when we look at the determinate objects, like the production of determinate objects in Hegel, and that, in terms of the first subject-object distinction, that's not where he begins the phenomenology of spirit. He begins at the immanency of consciousness, which is essentially the end of Cartesian.
We know.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then I'm just making it clear for the audience.
But it implies a subject-object distinction, which is
hang on. Let him finish his point. 10 seconds, Lewis. Then he can interrupt. Go.
Quite the opposite. It doesn't imply a subject-object distinction. It actually implies the infinite subject. That's the issue. It implies the infinite being, until we start to reconcile ourselves and destroy nature and replace it with a notion or a concept. And then the reconciliation of that notion and reality is the concept itself. When he says the concept or like spirit, you're right in saying that the truth of spirit is not like in nature itself. Like we don't like, you know, we don't have ethical knowledge like imbued within us. At least it's not knowledge in us. It's the grounds for knowledge. It's the grounds for truth, which is why Hegel points towards the law within me as well.
Okay,
But he doesn't say that it's like, he doesn't say specifically that he doesn't say specifically that we have knowledge in nature or something inherently.
Can we walk back what you just said, though? You just said that Hegel begins with the immanent consciousness, which is infinite subjectivity. Okay, and then you said it's before we have to destroy nature. Wait a second. We don't do anything, Lewis. It all follows immanently from the nature of consciousness itself, that the division between subject and object. So yes, consciousness does imply the division of subject and object.
But I will say it doesn't. We do something like, I think that
no, we don't do anything voluntarily. That's complete nonsense. What are you even talking
Hegel's
about?
not a determinist. Hegel is not a determinist.
You're saying that we begin with the infinite consciousness and then we voluntarily destroy nature and create the division of the subject and object?
In the words of Hegel, the substance is separated through action. Everything is a moment of will. Like,
okay, but that doesn't make it voluntary.
Here, hang on, one at a time. Lewis,
it is the will. It is. Sorry, it is the will.
The will figures in his ontology, though. The will is separate.
Let him finish his thought, Has. Lewis, go.
I was just saying that we are the will. That when we are acting, we are manifestations of the will.
The will is not separate from being.
I completely agree. Which is why when we are truly free, it's in spirit itself, which is the reconciliation of will with itself. But
spirit reveals the truth of consciousness, and if it reveals the truth of consciousness, the truth is that being entails the will. The will is part of being, and that therefore the subject-object distinction is implied by consciousness.
It's not that the will is part of being; it's that the will is being. That all there is will. Like that. Like, it's not to say that, like, so when we talk about what Hegel's seeing as the foundation, he wouldn't see a consciousness as something which is inert. It's not non-acting.
Okay, how does objectivity arise according to Hegel?
How does objectivity arise? Well, we would get it through the negative process of through self-conscious mediation.
Where did that come from?
So the master-slave dialectic.
Okay, where does that come from? Ontologically speaking, where does that latent potentiality come from? Is it something outside of being, or is it something imminent to being itself?
Nothing's outside of.
Okay, so let's stop saying that Hegel doesn't begin with an object-subject distinction implied by consciousness.
All right,
like, nothing's outside.
Lewis, respond.
Yeah, so nothing's outside of being as becoming. I mean, that's obvious. That's saying that there's something outside of existence. So be like, what's outside of existence? Like non-existence? Like, it doesn't make sense. Like the point of what Hegel's saying is that there are a few things. Actually, this is why I said what are the three infinites, because it's the three ontological infinites that are the foundations for this process. Okay, and I'll outline
now you can respond.
Okay, okay. Unless you want us to outline them, do you want us to outline?
Okay, Lewis, it's not relevant because me saying consciousness implies a subject-object distinction is 100% correct. It's as simple as that.
Wait, sorry, say that again.
Me saying that consciousness implies a division between subject and object, and that for a being to possess consciousness, it must be able to differentiate, it must participate in a subject-object distinction. It must be able to be cognizant of objects, to be conscious of some kind of content. That is 100% true. You contested it by talking about a lot of gibberish and word salad, and I had to rein you in, and now it seems like you're conceding on the point.
No, I would 100% say that the subject-object distinction is actually a product of language. I mean, this isn't even just in Hegel. We could go to Heidegger.
Consciousness presupposes language for Hegel.
Consciousness presupposes language. No,
yes, a conscious being is a being that possesses language for Hegel. Yes, it does. Yes, it literally does.
Why does he write?
For Hegel, consciousness is an object.
Hang on, one at a time. Has finished your thought, then Lewis respond.
Consciousness, yes, implies language and presupposes the elementary subject-object distinction proper to language. There is no conscious being that does not possess language according to Hegel, because the necessary mediation of arriving at what an object is for another, for some kind of subject, relies upon and implies language and the mediation of their natural world or whatever, the real world, by language. So yes, consciousness implies language. Like
Thank
I
you.
said, you don't seem
Lewis,
to fucking
hang on.
understand.
Has
Okay,
you
no.
responded, Lewis? You get to
Yeah,
respond now.
so that's fundamentally false. I mean, if you look at where he says determinate objects come from, because he starts with the infinites in two respects. I mean, you can look at the three infinites which he poses as within spirit, and then you can look, which maps very well onto notions of the Trinity, by the way. So when you look at and it's allegorical, and I don't think Hegel's doing anything.
Name what's relevant about the three infinites. Name what's relevant.
What's relevant?
Yeah,
okay,
here,
you have the
in this
self,
argument.
other, and matter. So the mediation between the self and the other is how we understand matter. And our understanding of the other is mediated through matter, and our understanding of self is mediated through both of them. It is a unity which, when separated, becomes incapable of producing knowledge. But when
who is
combined,
separating anything? Why? When did I separate this unity?
This is one, because the inconsideration of otherness within consciousness would be the separation there, I would argue. But
what are you talking about? I'm the one. You're the one who's trying to say that consciousness is some kind of infinite subjectivity, and that's all it is.
No, I never said conscious. I said that consciousness at the very beginning of the dialectic, consciousness is the infinite we begin with, and then we produce determinate objects. For anyone who
how do you produce determinate objects?
Okay, through negation.
And
so,
where does and so consciousness does not imply the negation. The negation comes from something else.
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm saying. So no, there is no way we could have had language, because to have language is to imply negation, to go this and not that.
Yeah.
There's a very famous quote by Blanchot where he says, "For me to be able to say this woman, I must take her flesh and blood reality away from her, destroy her." The whole point of giving a name to something.
You are trying.
Okay, hang on. Has finish. Then has respond. Go.
Yeah. So the whole point in naming something is to give it determinate existence, to say that it is not the infinite immediacy of consciousness, but a single entity in itself. And that is an act of language which is not presupposed in the immanency of consciousness.
Thank you.
First of all, Hegel says that language cannot actually name particulars. So you don't know what you're talking about in that regard. Secondly, like I said, you're trying to make it seem like Hegel is trying to say, ontologically speaking, consciousness as the immanent consciousness and infinite subjectivity that is not immanently already entangled with the two other infinites that give rise to the possibility of objectivity and therefore subject-objects distinction. You're trying to make it seem like Hegel is trying to say the infinite subjectivity isn't existent, and it's not. It's just a useful way. It's just something Hegel sets up to make it. It's something useful for Hegel to expound upon the relationship between consciousness and the world. But insofar as consciousness is taken as an existent, as something which beings possess.
Hang on, Lewis. Let him finish.
Sorry.
As finish your thought.
As something that beings possess, it necessarily implies a distinction between subject and object. How could a being possess consciousness without that implying a division between subject and consciousness? No determinate being whatsoever could possess consciousness. The infinite, the immanent.
I'm going to let Lewis respond now, Lewis.
The immanent consciousness you're talking about is not a determinate being. It's not something that exists in reality.
Okay, Lewis, respond.
So the immanent consciousness is reality, and I think you misspoke there, and I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. I don't think you meant between consciousness and the world. You meant between consciousness and itself, because consciousness is the world, right? He's an absolute idealist. Like, there is no separation between consciousness. It's being, in like, we are Dasein, right? The world, we are the world. Like, that's
in its otherness. Its otherness.
Yeah, okay. Well, in its determinateness. This is the difference. So we have the world in its determinateness, we have the world in its otherness, and we have the world in itself, which is the three infinites, right? So in reconciliation,
listen. Otherness means it's the relationship between consciousness and its I don't know if I would say apparent or its opposite, which is in fact, yes, for Hegel, ultimately a moment of itself. But that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and the consciousness of otherness exists in what?
The consciousness of otherness exists in what?
Mm-hmm. What does it exist in?
What are you asking?
How does it present? How does it present itself to consciousness? How does otherness?
In a determinate way.
But in what are we presented with as the other? What is being presented there?
What can you get to your point? What are you trying to ask?
We are
Like,
being
what-
presented with a manifestation of will. The
Okay.
separation between self, other, and determinateness is that a rock doesn't have a will, but another individual has. The
Okay.
mediation between the self and the other is what allows us to construct determinate objects, because they're the only active participants within substance.
Okay, a conscious being implies a being cognizant or participating in a division between subject and object. Consciousness implies the division of subject and object.
No, it doesn't. No,
Yes,
it doesn't.
it
And
does.
it doesn't do that for Hegel, and it doesn't even do that for Heidegger.
Why doesn't it? Explain.
Because Hegel doesn't start at the point of he already starts prior to the subject
What
object
does
division.
that have to do with where he starts? Consciousness
mean?
ultimately implies.
Let him finish his thought so he can say it.
Because if the chapter starts at consciousness, and then he outlines consciousness, and then outlines how objects are then formed from consciousness later on, he's not saying that we start with a subject-object distinction.
No, you fucked up the whole thing. In Hegel's beginning, yes, in the beginning chapter of consciousness, Hegel, he does imply the existence of objects. It's just that objects are given. They are given to consciousness. Have you even fucking read the book, dude? What are you saying? You're saying objects don't exist until the second chapter?
Let's take it down a bit.
No. I'm not saying that objects don't exist until the second chapter. I'm saying that the
Objects
first
are
movement
given
in
to
Hegel
conscious.
is
Hang
Objects are
on.
given to consciousness.
Let him respond.
I'm saying the first movement in Hegel is not the production of the object-subject division. It's the beginning of the immediate infinite.
Okay, he doesn't explain how the division.
Let him finish his thoughts so we have a coherent conversation here. Keep going.
Which is why in the phenomenology of spirit he describes either being and nothingness as either a room of bright white light, infinitely bright, or infinitely dark. There's no difference because there's no determination. There must be a combination between being and nothingness, which is being reconciled within consciousness, which allows us to produce determinate objects. We are the production of objects, and we do not find ourselves.
You're
Okay,
babbling.
Lewis, let Haz respond now. Okay.
You're babbling. Lewis, it's very simple. He may not arrive at in the first chapter how precisely the division is engendered, but that is different from saying the division isn't implied. The division is fucking implied in the first chapter because objects for Hegel are it is the immediate object of consciousness is objects in the world that relate to consciousness in an immediate in an immediate way, according to these philosophical perspectives he's critiquing. Hegel says, obviously, that such an immediate consciousness is not even possible, and he critiques the possibility of a real immediate consciousness. Like I said, there's a reason why chapter 1 leads to chapter 2, because of the inadequacy of chapter 1 in being able to actually arrive at the point of real absolute knowledge. But the division between the division between object and subject in the first chapter is fucking implied. Okay? That's if you don't know this, you haven't read the book.
Okay.
I don't
respond.
what I'll say is that the whole point of the first chapter is to show that the will's engagement with reality is an engagement with itself from which it seeks to satisfy itself. It is the attempt to self-satisfaction which produces the subject-object divide.
So what?
We produce the subject-object divide in an attempt to satisfy ourselves and find it inadequate, so then move to self-consciousness.
So what?
That movement.
Okay, guys.
Only
So
makes
what?
sense.
Hey, guys,
Only
both
makes
of you.
sense.
Hey, I will mute you. Let's bring this back to the question at hand. How does this bear on the veganism debate?
Okay.
Haz.
He's a fake Hegelian. I want to press him on this because so what that this is what endangers the division between subject and object. For Hegel, consciousness implies such a division.
Consciousness, first, does not imply such a division. The reason that it's relevant for the veganism debate is because he's trying to say that self-consciousness would be necessary, or like the subject-object distinction would be necessary for the consideration of consciousness simpliciter. I would have to imply
you don't understand what you're talking about. Self-consciousness is how Hegel elaborates how the distinction is endangered.
Hang on, Haz. Let him finish his statement, and then you can go.
So the whole point in Hegel is the mediation of the will in the attempt to produce a world from which it can satisfy itself. If the subject-object distinction was already presupposed, this would already imply that they had the world in a way which is mediated. but they seek mediation. It's the constant drive for mediation that moves consciousness to self-consciousness.
Okay, thank you, Lewis.
In the first place.
No, but here's the thing, Lewis. It's not such a drive that leads it to this. For Hegel, the conclusion is already implied at the premise. It's just developed at the end. When you get to the end of his fucking book, all of that is already there in the beginning. That's what you don't fucking understand. That's why you're not a Hegelian and you don't understand dialectics. For Hegel,
there at the beginning.
Yes, it is there at the beginning. It develops at the end. You learn the truth of what's at the beginning at the end. That is so elementary to Hegelian dialectics. How the fuck do you call yourself a Hegelian?
Okay, Lewis,
Hegel doesn't begin with a fucking dogmatic premise and then builds from the premise.
Lewis gets to reply now.
Like, beginning. I completely agree that it is the reconciliation of consciousness with itself, which I've been arguing this entire time. That doesn't imply the subject-object division in Hegel, and even in his successors. I mean, let's take someone who was very much inspired by Hegel, like Heidegger. When we take, being in the world and the production of language and determinate objects is one of the existential structures of Dasein from which we must analyze. So when we find ourselves in this thrownness and find ourselves with subject-object distinctions, in
every single subsection of the first chapter, a subject-object distinction is operative. In every single one, objects are given to the immediate consciousness. That is what Hegel is saying. Hegel is talking about why consciousness is imminently inadequate. He is not saying consciousness is some kind of discrete stage. He's saying that consciousness is almost a kind of perspective philosophers have had, which is ultimately inadequate to satisfy the need for absolute knowledge, which is the whole fucking reason why he wrote the book in the first place, to actually satisfy what it would mean to have absolute knowledge. And Hegel is saying consciousness.
Hang on, let him finish his thought, then you can respond, Lewis. Keep going, Has.
Consciousness as something. If Hegel begins with consciousness, he's not saying that this is like the structure of creation, like this is where God first created the world and then it developed like that. Okay, that is not the structure of his book. You're not a real Hegelian. You literally have such a
hang on. Okay. Thank you, Has, and Lewis, can you reply?
Like fighting straw men is really not doing you any good, mate. Like I have outlined my position time and time again. If you can't understand it, then I suggest either a reader's guide to the phenomenology of spirit
perspective. I'll break down your position.
Hang on. Has let him finish his response, and then I'll let you go.
But the argument that I'm making isn't controversial, and it's not something that even struggles to reconcile itself within spirit. The will is willing itself towards spirit. Now, you say that like the truth of spirit already exists in consciousness. I mean, yeah, in the sense that it's unmediated and without determination, but that precisely is why it's inadequate, which is why we move through. So I don't see why that's necessarily relevant, except for in relevance to my position, which is the consideration
because it implies the distinctions there from the beginning.
Hang on, Has. Try to be concise, Lewis, okay?
Yeah. So which is the consideration of the ontology of consciousness, which exists within animals as well as humans.
Okay, first of all, before we even get to that stupid fucking thing you just said, which directly contradicts Hegel's views that it exists in animals, Lewis, I know your position is crystal clear, and you haven't. The issue here, Lewis, is you're not responding to anything I'm saying in response to your position. Like an NPC, you just keep saying the same shit you said before without addressing the points I'm trying to raise. Hegel begins with consciousness. He doesn't actually establish within the first chapter how the subject-object distinction comes to be. Maybe, but that distinction is implied by consciousness itself. Okay, you don't understand the difference between these two different things. There is a difference between Hegel elaborating how the subject-object distinction comes into being and whether or not it is already implied and already there from the beginning. Hegel's a dialectician. He begins from a perspective of a radical difference, a radical discontinuity, a radical contradiction. I know some Hegelians take issue with that, but whatever, you get the fucking point. And that is always implied from the beginning. Hegel, you have a fundamentally undialectical understanding of the phenomenology of mind. If Hegel begins the writing of the phenomenology of mind somewhere, that doesn't mean he's actually beginning ontologically. The actual ontological beginning is revealed at the end. The nature of the essence of what was at the beginning is only revealed at the end, okay? The essence of consciousness, for example, what consciousness actually is as consciousness ontologically, that's something that's revealed at the end of his book, not at the beginning. Okay, the thing that drives the process along that you're talking about is precisely something that was always already there. That's why for Hegel, absolute consciousness follows necessarily. Absolute knowledge follows necessarily. These are all moments in its being, in
Lewis,
its reality.
Yeah, so I'm just going to say that the subject-object distinction is certainly not implied. I mean, that's the whole point of the Hegelian schemata. I mean, let's be honest, like the whole point of consciousness developing determinate objects is an attempt to satisfy itself.
You're an NPC. You're an NPC.
Hang on.
in the world,
within
the world. So the reason that we move to self-consciousness is because the desire to satisfy ourselves within the world has been frustrated by the existence of the other. We see something which is monstrous to us, a will which resists us,
Did you read it?
prevents our satisfaction. So the negative force which moves the dialectic is the frustration of the will itself, which, yes, is present.
Did you read the first chapter?
Has you had time? Lewis, finish your thought, please.
Yeah. So the negative force of the dialectic, which is moving us from negation to negation, is the frustration of the will attempting to satisfy itself in the world. And that's why he moves between hedonistic self-satisfaction and abstract notions of right.
Lewis, let me break it down for you very clearly, very concisely. Okay, at this point, if you don't respond, I'm going to assume you're an NPC. Let's break it down like this. We're going to go yes or no. In the beginning, the first chapter, does Hegel speak of objects for the immediate consciousness in the world?
Not for the immediate
consciousness. Does he speak about objects?
He speaks about objects, not for the immediate consciousness.
He does not speak about the givenness of objects for the immediate consciousness.
No, he talks about the determination of objects, which are
in the first chapter.
Yeah, we determine objects.
So he talks about objects. Objects are in the first chapter.
He does talk about objects. Yes.
Okay. In the first chapter.
Yes, he talks about
givenness. It's the givenness of objects for the immediate consciousness. Hegel rebukes the view of the given. Obviously, he shares that with Kant, but that is what he talks about in the first chapter. He doesn't actually believe they are just given, but he's not describing how they actually come to be and how they're endangered. But Hegel speaks about the fact that he's talking about the stages of philosophy. In consciousness, it appears to us, at the very least, that there are objects given already to consciousness. Now, the issue,
hang on, Lewis, let him finish his thought, then you can go.
That's what it appears as. It's not the case. Hegel is trying to explain why philosophers before him were beginning from that perspective, empiricism and so on and so on. Now, what the issue for Hegel is not that the issue is the will satisfying itself, okay? What it actually is, rather than these various objects in the world, which Hegel will obviously elaborate, instantiate the will's self for itself. Hegel is still saying that at the beginning, there are objects. Now, how are there objects is a different question. He elaborates that later. But in the beginning, consciousness does imply a division between subject and object.
Okay, thank you,
that division
we're going to let Lewis respond now, okay? Lewis, go.
Okay, that's actually, like, look, I can understand why you would make that mistake, but no, that the rejection of sense certainty comes precisely from the lack of sense certainty we can have. We do not have determinate objects.
I know, Lewis. Did you listen to what I said?
Let him finish
wasting time. Did you listen to what I fucking said
I did listen to what you said, which is why I'm responding. Look.
Yeah, obviously.
You're muted right now.
Okay, great. So essentially, like the way that self-consciousness works, before we move to self-consciousness, the way the consciousness works is self-satisfaction. So the production of determinate objects, it comes as a given in order to satisfy a one-sided will. It's dogmatic and inadequate, but it's still produced from an action of consciousness because everything is in motion. Remember that. It's not like a stagnant thing where we get presented an object. We produce objects to satisfy ourselves. That's the whole point. And it's about the production of the right objects to satisfy ourselves. How we objectify the world is the question in Hegel.
Am I unmuted now?
You are unmuted now, yes.
Okay. Lewis, you just admitted just now that in the beginning chapter, objects where you're saying they are produced for consciousness in the consciousness's quest for self-satisfaction. So consciousness does imply a division between subject and object.
No, the consciousness implies a desire for the division between subject and object.
But no, that division between subject and object is established by consciousness.
Consciousness establishes it. It's something that consciousness seeks to establish, not something
No,
that's
it does
already
establish
established.
it. It does
It's not something-
establish it.
That's the whole point, because the reconciliation of the world with itself.
Like,
is
okay, Lewis, can you
destruction.
respond? I want
Okay,
to
hang on. Has. Let him finish a sentence. Lewis, finish your thought, then Has.
The reconciliation of the world with itself is the destruction of the subject-object distinction. We no longer need it. The will is purely in tune with the world around it. It
Okay, thank you.
understands itself as the world.
Okay, Lewis, thank you. Has, go.
Okay, perspective philosophy. You're trying to obfuscate the question. I'm going to get to the meat and potatoes and just see if you can respond to this. Okay, just see if you can respond to this. For Hegel obviously says that the perspective of consciousness is not enough to actually exhaust how the subject-object distinction is arrived at. We cannot solely through consciousness arrive at the distinction between subject and object. But despite the inadequacy of consciousness alone in being able to arrive at this, that distinction is still there and operative. And that is precisely why consciousness is inadequate. The distinction is there even if consciousness is inadequate to understand it. You have not made it clear. You have not proven, you have not demonstrated you actually are aware of this distinction that I'm trying to fucking point you to. Can you please address this point I'm raising? There's a distinction between the how and the is.
Okay.
Has, no interrupting when he responds this time. Go.
Okay. The is, right, which would be being itself. And that's something that happened way before Hegel, by the way. This goes right back to Parmenides, right? Although Hegel would see this as an infinite negative and not an infinite positive, is an infinite nonetheless. It does not have form. The positing of essence is an action within consciousness. That's the point.
Lewis, am I unmuted?
You are unmuted. I'm not muting you except when you talk
Lewis,
over
for
me.
For the last time, Lewis. Consciousness inadequately attempts to seek knowledge of a division already set before it. A fundamental distinction between subject and object, which is implied by consciousness for Hegel, because for Hegel, consciousness seeks to arrive and explain the objects given before it, or that it believes to be given before it, which are not in fact given, but in fact engendered by consciousness itself. Yes. Hegel makes that very clear. You outlining some one-sided ontology, which in no way could possibly be Hegelian, because for Hegel, the implications of absolute knowledge are implications for being. In other words, for the nature of being itself from the start. Hegel doesn't say we begin from some kind of one-sided being and then voluntarily by means of philosophy add more to it. Philosophy itself participates in being for Hegel. So that distinction you're drawing is completely false. For Hegel, consciousness implies a division of subject and object, even if consciousness, like we're going in circles. Can you please demonstrate you even understand what I'm trying to say? Even if consciousness is inadequate, the so-called stage of consciousness is inadequate to comprehend how the division that is the very object of consciousness is possible to know, that division is still there and implied by consciousness itself, because consciousness implies a radical contradiction or discontinuity at the heart of being itself. Otherwise, there would be no consciousness, only a one-sided being.
Okay, it's on record now that your charge is that he's a fake Hegelian. I'm going to let Lewis respond to that, and then we're going to drop that charge going forward. Okay, we're just going to talk about the subject matter at hand. Lewis, please respond.
Okay, so like calling us a fake Hegelian, I think is just ridiculous. I mean, like, one, not because I've actually outlined Hegel. I would argue in a way that was more complete than you, and you won't actually answer my questions on Hegel, and I will answer any questions on Hegel. And when I do answer,
Except the ones I did.
Hang on, Has, let him respond.
And when I do answer, you just find the answer not to your liking, and so you get mad. But look, like even at the start of consciousness, like the beginning of the dialectical process is a pure here and now. It is a universal unity of experience. It is thisness, absolute presence. That's all it is. To go this and that is the next movement, right? Which isn't the next chapter. He does quite a few movements in a chapter. Which is why self-consciousness is a huge bit of the book. Like the next movement is a this and a that. It's going, this is a bottle, that is a microphone. That is the next
Objects.
movement. Yeah, that's the next movement, which is the proposal of objects against the subject. But prior to that, that distinction does not exist. And even before, and he even says,
yes, it does.
Because of its concrete contents, sense certainty eminently appears as the richest kind of knowledge, indeed a knowledge of infinite wealth for which no bounds can be found, either when we reach out into space and time, which is dispersed, or whether we take this bit of wealth and the division enter into it. Right?
Okay, now I'm just going to cut you off there. Lewis, because we're running a bit long on that response. I want to bring this back to, again, for the sake of clarity for the audience and for ourselves, what are the actual stakes here? We're debating a particular reading of Hegel ad nauseum. What are the stakes? Why does this reading matter?
It's about whether animals could possibly be conscious according to Hegel.
Which I would argue I've already established.
No, you haven't. You've quoted. All you do is quote shit without proving how it supports your fucking conclusions.
I've actually
I'm not disputing. No, you didn't. Your quotation about how Hegel says animals are conscious. He didn't say they're conscious, though. He didn't.
Lewis, respond.
But one, he does say that animals are conscious. He just says
show me the fucking quote.
Hang on, let Lewis respond.
Okay, wait a minute. Just wait right there. You want us to get some quotes for Hegel on animals? So
no. I want a quote that proves Hegel thinks animals are conscious, despite what he said in the philosophy of nature, that there's a distinction between spirit and nature.
Animals are in possession of themselves. Their soul is in possession of their body, but they have no right to life because they do not will it. Hegel does not agree that animals have a right to life.
Okay, how are they conscious by that quote?
Animals are in possession of themselves. Their soul is in a possession of their body. He doesn't go, rocks are in a possession of themselves.
Okay, but how does it prove they're conscious? All vegetables are in a sense also.
Okay, well, hang on. The question, Has. So for clarification, the question originally concerned whether or not Hegel regarded animals as conscious. So how does this prove they're conscious? These are two separate questions. So you can pick one to ask Lewis.
No, I'm asking him. How does that prove Hegel thinks they're conscious? Is my question.
Okay, so that's the one. Go, Lewis.
Okay, because Hegel proposes a soul or a foundational spirit that exists in the animal, which has not itself as its object, but only its externality. It is only direct relationship with the world where it seeks satisfaction. It's at the place we start.
Quote the relevant quote one more time. I'm going to show you why you're wrong.
Okay. So animals are in possession of themselves. Their soul is in possession of their body.
Their soul is in possession of their body. Does Hegel say that animals are in possession of their soul?
They have no right to life because they do not will it. So they are not in possession of themselves.
They are not. Okay, animals are not in possession of their soul. Their soul is in possession of their body, right?
Yes.
What do you think now, since you know so much about Hegel, what would Hegel say about vegetables in regards to the nature of their soul?
Well, actually, I can quote that.
Go ahead.
But only because he's horribly sexist. At one point, where he says men correspond to animals while women correspond to plants because their development is more placid and their principle underlies a vague unity of feeling. So, like the way that he takes, and this is really a byproduct, I would say.
I'm not asking you for quotes. I'm asking you, what does Hegel? How would he? Because I know he doesn't. How would Hegel? What he just described of animals, a soul in possession of their body. What would be the case for plants and vegetables?
I think I would probably say that he would probably make a distinction between something like life in general and describe it as vegetative, and that would be a byproduct of a metaphysical distinction which originated.
The organism
around
is
the time of-
geology,
Okay,
plant,
hang on.
and
Has
animals.
let him finish that sentence and then go.
So like this like if you look at Hegel's philosophy, like the way that spirit is kind of separated in terms of soul is very much built off Christian metaphysical analysis.
Okay, Lewis, I meant finish the sentence you're already on. Let's start.
Oh, right. Okay, fair enough. That's fine.
All right, Has, go on.
Okay, Lewis, you didn't answer my question. You're saying that Hegel thinks animals are consciousness because the soul is in possession of their body, right?
Sorry, I think animals are consciousness because their soul is in possession of their body. Yes.
Okay. What about
They have a
plants?
soul.
What about vegetables?
I would say that they don't have a soul, or
Why?
if they do have a soul, that it's
Why,
purely
according to
vegetative.
Hegel, would they not possess a soul?
Well, they don't necessarily not possess a soul. There are distinctions in the self because we all possess a notion of self, at least a notion of consciousness.
Okay.
To be
Are
real.
you aware that when Hegel's talking about soul, he's still within the realm, for as far as animals are concerned, he's still within the realm of in itself, not for itself. In other words, he's giving a description of a thing. So when he's talking about the soul of the animal, it's not the same as the soul in the human sense.
Yeah, there's a distinction from being in itself and being for itself, which I think is absolutely the movement from consciousness to self-consciousness.
But it's not. Okay, now let me ask you another question.
Hang on. Has. Let him finish and then reply. Go.
Like, I mean, you would have to presuppose that being for itself exists in consciousness in the first chapter, when he specifically says in the second chapter that being for itself.
The reason for that is because consciousness is inadequate. So, Lewis, here's what you don't seem to understand. For Hegel, consciousness does not exist as such. It is just something he refers to prove its inadequacy. But there's no use in talking about the consciousness of animals because
Lewis, let him finish.
No being can just be conscious. Consciousness is a moment of spirit. Okay, no being is consciousness. If consciousness is taken divorced from being a moment in spirit, you are precisely reifying something that Hegel is just establishing to prove its inadequacy, specifically within the history of philosophy. Empiricism, sense, and so on and so on. Hegel is trying to say, consciousness cannot exist outside of being a moment of spirit for Hegel. Whatever consciousness is, it's a moment of spirit. It's an inadequate, unfinished explication of absolute knowledge.
Okay, good. Lewis, respond.
Well, absolute knowledge contains everything, so everything is a part of spirit. That's the whole point. But the ontological commitment within the phenomenology.
You keep saying ontological.
Hang on, has you got time, Lewis?
Yeah. So this would be like the commitment to reality, which we obtain the abstract laws of right from. Like that's where we.
Before we get into that,
wait a minute. No.
Has.
Trust me, Sunday. I'm saving us time. I'm saving us.
I don't care.
I
do not care. I do not care. Lewis, finish your thought concisely, please, and then Has, you can respond.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is 100% like consciousness absolutely is a thing for Hegel. To say that is absolutely ridiculous. We said in the introduction of the phenomenology of spirit, the phenomenology of spirit is the science of consciousness. It's exposition that consciousness has the concept of science.
Sure. So two things, right? Two things, because you let him keep talking, it piles up the bullshit. Two things, Lewis. The first thing, Hegel begins with the science of consciousness, but the science of consciousness is not the same thing as consciousness taken one-sidedly within the first chapter of the phenomenology of spirit of consciousness. So for example, the science of consciousness leads to the conclusion of absolute knowledge, yes, but consciousness cannot be taken in a vacuum one-sidedly within what the essence of consciousness is, especially ontologically, cannot be taken within a vacuum within the first chapter of the phenomenology of spirit, because it necessarily follows from consciousness that there is self-consciousness, and from self-consciousness that there is spirit, and so on and so on. So this is what you don't seem to understand. Now, you keep talking about Hegel's ontological commitment to consciousness, and I keep trying to pin you down, and you keep avoiding my question. What is, for Hegel, the being of consciousness? Is the being of consciousness fully exhausted in the first chapter of the phenomenology, or is the being of consciousness inadequately and inadequately described in the first chapter? Is the being of consciousness all there in the first chapter without any further elaboration?
Is its being, like, purely is what it is purely there, like its existence? Is that what you mean?
So for Hegel, Hegel's ontological commitment to consciousness, what you mean by that is that Hegel is committed to the ontological the ontological exceptionality of the consciousness that he describes in the first chapter of the Phenomenology. Is that what you're trying to say?
What I'm trying to say is that, like, I can actually, I'll outline this in a really easy way. Everything that is necessarily there to be understood in Hegel is within the immediacy of consciousness, but it is inadequate for us to will ourselves. So we reconcile ourselves. The movement of consciousness seeks to reconcile itself with itself.
How can it already be there if it's inadequate?
Because if it wasn't already there, then there would be nothing to reason and there'd be nothing to actually exist.
Okay.
It's the positing
hang on. Has let him finish his thought.
It's the positing of existence which we are reasoning out. It is reality itself, which is what Hegel is saying is already there. That reality is real. That existence exists. What is. It's tautological, which is why it's infinite. It is.
Now I got you. I got you. Sure, I got you now. So this reality, according to that, is already there for Hegel. This Hegel fully exhausts already in the beginning. He sets it up fully in the beginning. Everything else is just kind of ancillary, right?
Well, I mean, like, in the sense that, like, he doesn't fully exhaust the foundations of reality. He just says that we move beyond the immediacy of self-certainty and move towards
now let me ask you another question. The same question in a different way. Do we move beyond this immediate reality, or was there something latent within this reality that leads to it moving beyond with regard to itself?
Quite the opposite. Actually, if you look at Hegel, we move back to immediacy.
But I'm just quoting you.
Wait, hang on. Let him finish.
I'm just quoting you to help you guide you why you're a fucking idiot.
Let him answer.
So if you look at Hegel, we don't actually move away from the immediacy of reality. We mediate to move.
That's what you said. You said we moved away from it. Why are you wasting my?
As you're muted. Lewis, finish your response.
We move back to the immediacy. So we do mediate in the second term, but only to make and reconcile ourselves with ourselves, so it's immediately available. To give you a quote from this, if it would maybe help.
Fuck the fuck out of here, man. You fucking quote. Fuck.
Oh, get ragged.
All right. Is he still here? Has? Okay, Lewis, finish your thought, please, concisely, and then we're going to let Has respond.
Fucking waste of time.
So, essence is reflection for Hegel. So the positing of the positing of an essence is actually the movement in self-consciousness, but the grounding of essence is the foundation in the concrete existence which exists in consciousness. And he says that in, I think that was the Science of Logic.
Okay, are you done? Okay, Has, you can respond now. All right, I don't know what that means, but I'm not allowing it. Has only languages that the host can understand, please.
You're literally just quoting shit. You're not getting to the fucking point. You're quoting gibberish, saying gibberish to dance around the way I fucking pinned you. You said, Lewis, not me, that everything is there in the beginning, but it's not enough, so we have to move beyond. Is this not enoughness itself a feature of what is originally there or not?
Well, yeah, but I mean, the deficit is one of knowledge, not of reality.
That's where you're a fake fucking Hegelian and a Kantian. Yes, it is a deficit of being itself. It is definitely a deficit of being itself, not just knowledge, Lewis. There is no one-sided distinction between being and knowledge that is not actively suspended in Hegel's philosophy. Hegel does not simply set up being versus knowledge and then it ends there. Being and knowledge are, for Hegel, thinking and being for Hegel are the same, Lewis. They're the same thing ultimately. So you're a fake fucking Hegelian.
Look, hang on, wait.
Fraud.
Okay,
it wouldn't be thinking, enough. Just to clarify, it would be willing, actually.
All right.
Hegel says thinking and being are the same. He says that.
Yeah. It's a will.
I'm talking to both of you, Lewis.
You want to interpret it as a will.
Lewis and Has, you're both muted because you're not listening to me. So I will I will suffer a lot, but not that one of my participants be accused of being a Kantian. So we're going to move into audience questions. Again, if anybody has a question, you may put it in my chat, otherwise I won't see it. I need you to put an asterisk on either end so I can quickly cycle through and find them. Thank you very much. Let's find some questions here. I've got a question for both of you, actually. We've been talking a lot about whether or not animals are conscious. I want to know what the stakes are, if indeed they are. Why does it matter whether or not animals are conscious?
Because it, first of all, A, proves he doesn't know anything about Hegel if he says that. B, even though I already wrecked him as far as the supposed necessary conclusions that would follow from this, and even if I were to concede that animals are conscious, which I don't, the conclusion obviously doesn't follow. We established that last time. He didn't even respond to any of my arguments. But first of all, you're not even able to arrive at the conclusions you did in the first place because your fucking premise is wrong. Animals are not conscious.
Lewis, do you want to reply to that?
Yeah, so I will say that I think it's quite funny that he says that it doesn't matter if animals are conscious, even though the whole point of what he's arguing here is to go, I was way too charitable. I shouldn't have said animals are conscious because this means that we are considering animals within.
Here's the thing, Lewis. I am fully Lewis.
Hang on, Has. The way StreamYard works is that if both of you speak at the same time, you both turn into a garbled mess and nobody can hear. So Lewis, finish your thought, then Has, you can address it.
Yeah, I just think that he's backpedaling. I think that he's attempting to undo the debate that he had because it was that bad.
Oh, really?
And
Lewis?
then he's done
is
even
that why
worse.
Lewis, you always conflate shit. Lewis, here's what I just said. And Sunday, don't let me say my piece, Sunday. Okay?
Yeah, it's your turn.
Here's what you said, Lewis. You said that, oh, you're just trying to, it's funny that you're saying it doesn't matter because that's the whole point of this debate. The whole point of this debate, Lewis, don't get it twisted, Lewis. I am 100% fully confident in the fact that I fucking wrecked you last time. I just didn't wreck you as thoroughly as I wanted to, and that's why I'm doing this, Lewis. Even if I conceded to you that animals are conscious, as I proved last time, you'd still get fucking wrecked. But for the sake of being philosophically consistent and consistent with my own beliefs and my own views, I want to clarify that I was wrong to even concede that in the first place, even though it doesn't make a difference as far as who wins this little encounter between you and I. That's why, Lewis, I wanted to have this fucking debate and clear this shit up, because this debate not only proves yet again another victory for me, but that you literally don't know shit about Hegel, and that is something I don't think I proved well enough last time. I proved it well enough this time.
Okay. Question for Has from Seeking A. Independent of Hegel, if animals are conscious, would this change your view of veganism?
There's no independent of Hegel. Animals, the notion of I understand my concept of consciousness comes from German idealism, comes from this kind of philosophy. So no, it's an absurdity to call fucking animals conscious. I will never accept animals as so-called conscious. It's completely meaningless, completely stupid to call them that.
Okay. And this is for both of you. From Angelo Marni. I'm going to let Lewis go first on this one. How does consciousness imply an object-subject distinction? Is it baked into the meaning of consciousness itself?
Yeah, so it doesn't. That's the whole point when you start in Hegel. It is the infinite experience. Consciousness doesn't imply an object-subject distinction. That comes later. Like that is the subject. Like, well, not the subject. The consciousness produces the object-subject distinction as a means of self-satisfaction, which is why if you go on after Hegel and you get to Heidegger and you start learning about existential analysis and so on, you start seeing that language is actually a form of equipment in which we use to engage with reality. So this production of self-consciousness and objects and determinate objects actually is a means to self-satisfaction and not given in our experience, which is exactly why he's critiquing self-certainty.
All right, Has, do you want to reply to this?
Yes, consciousness does in fact necessarily imply a subject-object distinction. Otherwise, consciousness could have no determinate content whatsoever. There's absolutely no meaning to calling something conscious if you don't have a subject-object distinction. It's a pretty... and I already proved that through the course of this debate. Like an NPC, he's repeating his original argument. That's fine.
Okay, thank you. And this is from G.A. Korobov. Thank you for the $5. Perspective philosophy, you say quote-unquote will a lot. It seems like you're focused on actualism more than anything else. Are we seeing the triumph of your will? I'm not entirely certain how that...
He's implying he follows Gioventali's actual idealism.
No, what I'm arguing the whole point of bringing up will in Hegel is to show that it's not a stagnant process. That being is not there in itself. It's actually his reply to Zeno's paradox, which explains that everything must be in motion. Like if you were to shoot an arrow and you were to stop time at any moment, Zeno's paradox is supposed to say that the arrow would have to both be there and not there simultaneously.
Hegel overcomes the distinction. You don't know what
Hang
you're
on, the
talking about.
questions. The questions for Lewis. Let him finish.
That is exactly what I'm saying. It's a moment of becoming. It's not a moment of being there or not being there. It is both simultaneously.
Okay, just to clarify, the idea of pure will is just as absurd for Hegel as pure being.
Okay. This is for both of you, from Einzelganger. I have a question. Why should I care if animals feel pain or not? I can justify that we have a social contract between us. I take them to mean us humans, but what is the social contract between me and an animal? What morally prevents me from harming an animal? Haz, would you like to take that one first?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I completely doubt animals have so-called pain as we know it. I think pain is something we take for granted. There's a lot of things about pain we take for granted. It's not just a sensation, okay? Like I said, the fundamental distinction, you don't even have to talk about this stuff about a social contract or whatever. As someone else pointed out that I saw on Twitter, which was actually such a great way of summing up what I was trying to say before, the question of harming animals or not harming animals has nothing to do with morality, has nothing to do with ethics. It's a question of normativity. Okay, you can't legislate. You can't. It's no more relevant to ethics and morality than aesthetic taste is. So, yeah.
Okay, Lewis.
Yeah, so like the idea of a social contract, like being able to form a social contract, is in and of itself a bad way to establish ethics. Hegel actually points this out. He basically shows that everything that you're doing in the social contract already must pre-exist the contract for you to be able to accept that an individual could complete the contract, that they're capable of actually signing and understanding and engaging in a contract and having it as the end of their will. So the whole point is it presupposes an ethical relationship in which you already can have a trust established in order to sign the contract, or even have the capacities necessary, or even the fundamental tenets set that you would require for to experience to even want to sign a contract. All of that is already presupposed in social contract theory. So saying that signing a social contract it's a bad way to do it. So looking at an animal's inability to sign a contract is secondary. Why is a human able to sign a contract, and why do I establish contracts with humans? So if I want to sign a contract with a human, it's so that we can facilitate a joint end in order to satisfy a joint will. Now, if I already established that this joint will exists prior to the contract, the foundations of that will exist in ontology, but they're also epistemologically available to us by analysis, and that exists in an animal. I can see their pain and pleasure as valuable prior to their ability to sign a contract, because that is exactly the same pain and pleasure that I would see as valuable prior to the human's capacity to sign a contract, which I must consider.
For Haz, from Android323, what does it matter what an old man said if science nowadays proves animals being conscious?
Because science proves no such fucking thing. Simple as that. See how I get straight to the point and I don't babble along like perspective philosophy to say in so many words what you can sum up in like 2 seconds?
Okay. For perspective philosophy from King of Based, do you deny the labor aristocracy?
I don't really know. I can't, to be entirely honest with you, I don't think I could give like a definite answer, because I can't really remember I don't even know what the labor aristocracy is off the top of my head, to be entirely honest with you. I'm just going to I'm willing to admit me ignorance here in terms of the terminology.
Fair enough. From Angelo Morni, and I take this to be for both of you, is absolute knowing the final and necessary development of consciousness? Will animals ever achieve, quote unquote, absolute knowing?
According to Lewis, yes, they will. They're on their way. So the cow uprising is imminent.
That's not actually what I think. Cows don't establish absolute knowing. Humans do.
Yeah, but for
do.
Hegel, consciousness implies the inevitability of absolute knowing. It's because it's inadequate.
No, it doesn't.
Oh, really?
But the thing is, it requires an intellective capacity, which is what animals are.
Hang on, let him finish his response.
But the reconciliation of spirit and consciousness is the movement from being an immediate consciousness to a reconciled self-consciousness. That's not to say that animals are going to be that can be present in spirit in the sense that it is consciousness's reconciliation with itself, but it is mediated not by their actions, but by our actions and our consideration of their actions. So like they engage with us and communicate with us, and we can recognize what is valuable within them, and that is recognized in spirit
This
itself.
literally proves veganism is fascist. Like, you're describing a voluntaristic, actual idealist reading of Hegel, according to which everything is just some kind of like subjective, actual intervention in reality, rather than the fact that absolute knowledge literally follows imminently from consciousness.
It's
Literally,
so ironic.
consciousness
It's so ironic
is-
that you
conscious-
Hang on, Lewis, let him finish his
consciousness is immanently inadequate with regard to itself. It can't exist by itself.
it's so ironic that you would accuse veganism as being fascist when you are actually
Hitler was a
moving through a
vegan.
motion which is ideologically an abstract, where you're presupposing some idealized version of man and
No,
hegemon
man.
and seeing it as a sublime objective ideology from which we look
You
through.
think the Nazis
then-
were humanist?
and
Hang on,
then-
hang on. Has,
and
Wait,
then-
are the Nazis humanist?
and then say and then satisfy our desires.
The Nazis,
one
the
engaging-
Nazis
you're the one
venerated
has
vegetarianism.
let
The
him finish
Nazis
and
loved
respond.
veganism.
You're the one engaging in what is an abstract moment of right that is being justified by what? The hegemony of man.
When did I
It's
say that?
ironic.
You don't even know my
It's
fucking views.
ironic.
You're putting words in my mouth, talking out of your fucking ass, just like your pretended knowledge of Hegel. It's
You
clear
keep
that the
fighting
Nazis were
straw men.
pro-vegetarian. The
The
Nazis were pro-vegetarian. That's a fact of history.
Nazis were not.
Yes, they fucking
pro-vegetarian.
were. Yes, they fucking were.
Vegetarian. They used methods to kill the Jews that were taken from slaughterhouses.
Yeah.
The reason
Do you
that
know
we-
why did Nazis demonize
Hang on,
kosher slaughter?
has let him
Why
respond.
did the
and then you
Nazis
can go.
demonize kosher slaughter?
because they hated
were-
the Jews.
Well, what was the explanation they gave? That it was cruel toward animals. That's why they said the Jews were being cruel toward animals, and Nazis thought animals have more rights than Jewish
Jews.
people, just
It's
like vegans.
Propaganda. It's not like we love animals. It's like we hate the Jews. The Jews are worse than us. Everything's bad
Hitler
about
was
the
a vegetarian himself.
Hitler wasn't a vegetarian. That's a myth, and it was a way to propagandize himself in respect to being comparable to Gandhi, who was popular at the time. But whatever. Fuck history, right?
All right, next question from ThoughtBat. For Has, are you permissive of animal abuse? If not, why not?
No, I'm not, because I don't believe that our relationship to the world comes from thin air. It's established by precedent, custom, mores, and common sense. Why would you want to be abusive toward an animal if not the fact that you're projecting upon that animal human qualities and characteristics, and you want to use the animal as a way to vent your own misanthropy? So no, I don't believe in intentionally abusing animals. But if animals are not being treated up to the standards of what vegans think as an incidental fact of our already existing fundamental relationship to them, then I don't give a shit. I obviously think sadism is fucked up in general, but no, I don't give a fucking shit about animals.
Okay. Lewis, this is from Forehead, who has asked this question now 4 times. Are cars vegan?
Yeah, cars can be vegan anyway. Not all cars. The reality is that we can engage in modes of consumption, which unfortunately will lead to states of tragedy, which we should reconcile. But only ones that are really considering everyone, but then attempting to minimize harm. So, for example, look at it like this. I have an obligation to other humans, but if I drive a car, I have a risk of running them over. It's not that I'm going to kill I want to kill someone, but that there is an aspect of our being which necessitates our driving the car. I have to drive a car to get to work. I need to satisfy my own needs and drives. So having a car is not inherently unethical.
Okay, this is from G.A. Korobov for $5. Perspective philosophy. You sound more like a neo-Hegelian. How is this concept of Hegel anything but a precursor to the worst ideas in human history?
Well, I am a Hegelian. I don't think it's a precursor to the ideas, the worst ideas in history. I don't see how you could say that. I mean, what are you considering the worst ideas in history? Are you relating this to perhaps I don't know, movements from the Marxian side of things? Which I don't think were necessarily the worst ideas in history, but I'd say that a lot of the negative within the Marxist-Leninist movement come from the rejection of the negation of negation within Hegel, which meant that they started presupposing that essentially notions of right without reconciliation.
That's not true. So first of all, the rejection of the negation has nothing to do with the rejection of reconciliation. It's rather a point of, I'm going to quickly just sum this up. Reconciliation reemerges from the dialectical materialist perspective in the form of material being. Material being is what reconciles and leads to a. So it's not that they reject the negation of the negation as reconciliation. They do accept that the negation is ultimately negated. It's just negated by positive material being. It's a very important distinction. They do not reject Hegelian reconciliation. They reject the view that the negation of the negation as a metaphysical view, which leads to a kind of still, negation of negation does not arrive at positive being. That's their issue.
I'm going to modify this question from Seeking A because I think
just quickly add?
Please go for it.
Mao actually certainly does reject the negation of negation.
Yeah, but
he says
how?
That, he says that there are. He points towards particulars, and that everything can be infinitely divested into smaller and smaller units, and in society, and he points that towards that. So,
Yeah,
he definitely doesn't say that it can be reconciled. He says that there is the constant unity of opposites.
Yes, because for Mao,
let him finish his thought, and then you can respond. Go.
But then they're never reconciled. That's the point. Like the contradiction must exist in a form of contradiction that is never reconciled. In the Maoist tradition.
Let's go.
I'm very quickly. I just want to clear.
No, please go for it. You have time. Just he needs to get his thought
listen, out. Louis, it is actually reconciled. It's just that you don't understand the Chinese tradition Mao is coming from. Mao is ontologizing contradiction itself as a form of positive being. So it is reconciled in the form of this material positive being, which for Hegel is the very unity of opposites itself. The content of the material object for Mao is the unity of opposites, which he is inheriting from the Chinese philosophy, the Chinese tradition. And it's also something, this orientation towards being itself, positive being, as opposed to the negativity of thought, is something that distinguishes Eastern philosophy and thinking from Western in general. So to say that he doesn't accept a reconciliation is wrong. He accepts a reconciliation. It's just that this is a reconciliation in reality itself, in the form of the very being of the unity of opposites itself.
Thank you. Well, I'm gonna cut you off there, Louis, because we're gonna get to the next question. This is from Nimrod's Fall to Haz. Haz, how do you differentiate between your view and the view that some scientists used to have that non-whites lacked consciousness and pain vis-a-vis animals?
Because your comparison of non-whites to fucking animals is precisely why veganism is a white supremacist ideology that is the enemy of mankind.
Okay.
So just too core Q. That's just how you're going to respond to that.
Yeah, because I get straight to the point instead of wasting people's time like you.
That's not a point. That's a too core Q. That's a logical fallacy.
What do you
criticize a criticism with a criticism?
Wait, what?
You're like someone's just went, how would they've asked you a question and then you went, you're a white supremacist.
Yeah, the reason it's different, Louis, is because there's a fundamental, because non-white people are still fucking human. I don't know, is that enough for you?
I didn't take the question to be making that implication. I thought the point was that the equivocation goes in the other direction, whether or not animals should be raised up to the general status of having equal value to human beings. That's how I interpret that question. It didn't have the negative connotation at all. But that's just me.
Okay, what I'm saying is that the reason why you can't compare it is because there's a fundamental difference between humans and animals, and that non-white people, the difference between non-whites and whites is not the same as the difference between humans and animals. That's how I would respond. Jesus Christ.
That's what they want you to establish. What is the difference?
Okay, well, that's a different question. If he wants to know what precisely
that's my question.
Your question is what precisely is the difference between humans and animals?
That justifies ethical inconsideration.
Wait, are you asking me that question?
What's the difference between humans and animals, which justifies their ethical inconsideration?
Yeah, sure. You know what my answer to you is?
What?
Read Hegel.
That was terrible.
Just read Hegel. He talks about it. He elaborates pretty
okay.
well.
Okay. Next question.
Insecure.
All right. There's a premise to this one. Are either of you aware of meta-modernism or post-postmodernism?
I'm aware of it. I know very little about it, to be entirely honest with you. I need to read into it. Somebody sent us this on one of me prior streams, but I can't say I know very much about it, to be entirely honest with you.
Okay.
I don't remember. I remember encountering it, and I remember what I thought when I read up on it. Encounters that I wasn't impressed by it, and I thought it was a bunch of bullshit. But I don't remember specifically why. But that's my memory.
Yeah, I have no knowledge of this whatsoever. This is from Seeking A. I'm going to modify this slightly. If you were pressed, how would you salvage the position of your opponent? Has, do you want to go first, or Lewis? I'll let you choose amongst yourself.
If Lewis was an intelligent person, then they would come at this from the perspective of a cosmology. He wouldn't try to collapse the distinction between nature and spirit, which is antithetical to the Hegelian enterprise. He would try to actually reconcile them from the perspective of cosmology, similar to Evald Ilyenkov's, his cosmology of spirit. But this is a necessarily materialist enterprise, though. And he would, from this cosmology, try to establish how animals figure into the ultimate development of spirit from the perspective of the development of spirit as something that arises out of nature, and how spirit is, in fact, part of nature, and so on and so on. So if he was smart, he would come at it from that perspective. It's just he's not smart enough to do that, so he has to lie about Hegel and pull shit out of his ass.
Lewis?
I mean, it depends on what you mean by salvage. Do you mean like as in make a steel man of the argument, or do you mean
To the best of your ability. Perhaps you regard the position as unsalvageable, but to the extent that you can.
Right. So I would say that his position perhaps could argue, if he was being like justified about it, would be to accept that animals were conscious, but then say that, and then try to do. I think, to be honest, his argument in the first debate was stronger than his argument in this one, although still terrible. He essentially tried to argue an epistemological difference in that one, which meant that animals couldn't be considered because we cannot demonstrate the resistance in their will, which would lead us to a discussion of whether we can establish
They have no will.
having like interests which we can consider. That would be the best argument that he could make, but I still think a very poor one.
All right, this is from G.A. Korobov, again for $5. Again to Perspective Philosophy. By Neo-Hegelian, I meant genteelly. Perspective Philosophy, are you aware of some of the abstractive concepts you introduce? Are you aware that these seem a lot like actualism?
I'm not really. I've never really encountered this so much, to be entirely honest with you. But I'm not really introducing an abstract concept. I'm not saying that there is anything that necessarily must be accepted as its pure abstract essence, but rather that we need to reconcile what is a pure abstract essence with the fundamental concrete reality, which is fundamentally Hegelian.
Wait, what does that have to do with actualism?
I just said I've never encountered actualism, and
So you don't know. So you don't know what he's talking. He's not saying you have an abstract concept. He's saying that your interpretation of Hegel is pretty much the same as Giovanni Gentile's actual idealism.
Well, Giovanni's
he's the founder of intellectual founder of Italian fascism. Yeah, Italian fascism.
Yeah. I haven't read his work yet. I was going to read it to respond to fascists, but I haven't met a fascist Hegelian yet because I think that's died.
I think I've just met one today, which is I met one last week, which is you.
That's absolutely dumb. Like let's be honest. Like what I'm arguing.
Okay, you're not a fascist. I wouldn't call you a fascist, but like philosophically, I think you are.
I don't think that's the case at all, considering that I'm arguing for a mediation of the self with the self in a way that reconciles us from in and out groups to a unified individual. So
that
like fascism requires an us versus them notion in which we can posit a single identity against the other.
Not necessarily. Fascists, for example, can have a view of like world conquest, like Hitler, where there's going to reconcile all beings but it's going to be in like a determinate hierarchy with Germans at the top, just like animals would figure in the hierarchy.
But the hierarchy,
other races
the hierarchy in and of itself, I think in a Hegelian stance would be absolutely unjustified.
Why? We have a hierarchy. You admit we need a hierarchy with animals, or you don't admit that?
No, I don't think that we should hierarchize like
really.
At all
so if you see like a baby and a baby like chicken, and which one would you save? Because there's no hierarchy.
I would do my duty.
And do what? Which one would you save?
Well, I'd probably do my duty to society and my family and like whatever.
So your society is a determinate society, right? It's not just like a universal society.
But if at the point of absolute spirit, if you were to say like what matters more, a chicken or a baby, they're equal in value.
Okay, so how can you not? Why don't you transpose?
Hang on, has let him finish his response, and then you can reply.
Yeah, so that's a movement from Hegel's meta-ethical commitments or Hegel's ontological commitments.
It's not my point.
Hegel's normative commitments. Hegel's normative commitments are duties. And how we express that notion of right.
Lewis, let's bring it back to the point. The point was there's clearly a hierarchy between humans and animals.
Clearly, yet you haven't established it.
Yeah, no, but you just established it. You agree that animals cannot have the same rights human beings can.
What do you mean? When did I say that they can't have the same rights? I absolutely do think they can have the same rights. There's some rights that would be
Really?
applicable. So, like, I wouldn't give a child, for example, the right to vote, and I wouldn't give a dog the right to vote, but I'd
No,
certainly
so
give them
which
the
one
right
is
to
it?
life
Is
and
it the
liberty.
same? Is it the same rights or it's not the same rights? Which one is it?
Hmm?
Is it the same rights or is it not the same rights? Which one is it?
Well, it would be the same right.
No, the same
Rights.
right. I didn't say right in the
same,
abstract. I
the
said
same
rights.
rights. The rights, quote unquote.
Can you stop dancing around the point? Would they have the same rights or
I'm
would they be
actually-
unequal?
Well, no, you don't have to have the exact same rights to be equal.
Okay, colloquially, from the common sense perspective, would animals be equal to humans?
Animals
Okay,
would
what
be-
you're arguing, you can argue also from the Nazi perspective. You don't. Not everyone has to have the same rights.
Okay, Has, let him
Equal.
reply.
Well,
Like-
like, look at it like this. Like, would Hegel have said that everyone has the same right to the money that exists in my family if they don't live in my family? No,
Okay,
like
okay.
that's not how it works.
That's fine.
People's rights are dependent upon the context. which
Sure,
is why
sure,
rights
Louis, but we
are
haven't. You
subject
haven't established how it's
right.
different from Nazi.
Okay, hang on. Let him finish, and then Has, you can go.
How is
Louis,
it
try to be quick.
How is it different from Nazism? Because we're considering everyone equally, and the notion of rights is being delved out from that position.
Yeah, the Nazis are saying we're treating everyone equally, just like how you're saying we would treat all animals equally. But if there's differences in the content of the rights, that's not because there's no equality. It's just because of the differences in determinate reality, just like the family example you mentioned.
Quite
that's
the opposite.
addressing my
Quite the
point.
opposite, because the
Why?
determinate reality from which you're proposing is the subject-object division, I'm saying is necessarily inadequate to establish right, and that it needs to be reconciled with consciousness in its
Sure.
infinite.
Okay, Louis.
Not, which is the whole point of this
Louis,
debate.
I know you're
Okay,
trying to avoid
Louis,
the
let
point.
Has reply. Go.
Louis, I know you're trying to avoid the point. My question's very simple, right? Why? Okay, so clearly, okay, animals would be treated differently than humans, right? According
Yes.
to you. Okay,
Yes,
let's
as
just
children
begin
are
with that.
treated differently to adults.
So why shouldn't different races be treated differently from the Nazi perspective? What's wrong with that?
Because the Nazi perspective deliberately undermines the value that exists in a race, and it proposes an abstract notion of value in, let's say, like something like Germanness, right? Like where there is no value. It's
Well,
a
it's
presuppositionalist position.
That's not necessarily true because
is.
Germanness is just referring to the actual determinate society in which Germans live. Whereas other
Okay,
and
for both of
also-
you, again, the platform we're on, if you both speak over each other, it becomes a garbled mess that nobody can hear, so you silence yourselves. One at a time. Has, finish your thought, then Louis respond.
Yeah. So basically, and also you could also say that Hitler might argue that German society represents the fullest and most developed. I think Nazis did argue this. Developed expression of spirit, the most in the world, and that it necessarily does entail a hierarchy of races. So why does that not follow from your perspective as well?
Because the establishment of a hierarchy in terms of conscious beings is exactly what is being undermined by the Hegelian position, which is
No.
consideration of
The Nazis are not as.
Hang on,
Alex,
Has, let him finish.
the consideration of determinate being is inadequate, which is why we start at consciousness, which is what you've missed this entire time. You're the one that's presupposing an abstract determinate fucking notion of right within society.
No, I'm not. Prove it.
Okay, you are putting forward an anthropocentric position where there is no justification for that in consciousness itself.
So what?
So that is fundamentally
No. So what?
and
That there's no so what? That there's no justification in consciousness itself. And how am I establishing an arbitrary, abstract primacy of humanity over everything else?
because you're unwilling to consider that animals are valuable.
That doesn't
because
mean
they
I have an
are-
abstract
Okay,
perspective.
hang on.
It
Louis,
doesn't
finish your thought.
logically necessarily
Hang on.
follow.
Okay,
that
Has.
entails
Let him
that
reply.
my view of
He hasn't-
humanity is abstract.
Has, let him reply.
He derailed the topic. I was asking him why.
Okay, so but you can point that out when you respond, but he needs to be able to finish the sentence, otherwise we don't know what
It's
he's
like
saying.
5 different things we're
derailed the
arguing about
topic.
now.
I derailed the topic. You're trying to paint me
He's
as
trying
a
to bring this
fascist.
back to a debate
You're
I
trying-
already won
you're
about.
trying to- you're-
Nobody talk over me. That's the rule. Louis, then Has. Be quick. Louis?
Okay, right. Okay, great. So the reason I'm not derailing the topic, I'm defending myself against claims of fascism, and I'm showing that the Hegelian critique of fascism would be the inadequacy in spirit. I don't care what Nazis think of themselves. Of course, they have delusions of grandeur. That's basically entailed in that position, but that's because they're looking from through a sublime objective ideology which paints Germanic superiority as being justified, just as your position paints anthropocentrism as being justified. You look through Adam, they look through Hitler.
Has go.
Yeah, two things. And this is why I'm saying this is taking so long. Two things. Okay, the first thing, no, it doesn't necessarily follow, because from your perspective, which is one of actual idealism, the actual triumph of the will and the actual triumph of the will, if you will, as far as the Nazis are concerned, is a decisive moment. So the Nazis are merely saying, well, since it's not a given in being, just like how you said, it requires our will to establish what was already true. The Nazis are not saying for abstract reasons we elevate ourselves above others. They're saying this is actually the case in reality. We've proven it by our military prowess and superiority. This is just the manifestation of our actual will, our triumph of the will. The second thing is that your claim about that my humanity is an you have a completely, you just pulled something out of your fucking ass. I'm a fucking Marxist materialist dialectic. You think I have an abstract humanism, some kind of abstract bourgeois humanism? No, I have a Marxist humanism. My Marxist humanism has nothing to do with arbitrarily elevating some kind of form to the status of supremacy against which all reality is being related. You haven't proven that's my position. Nothing I've said implies or demonstrate that's my position. If you want to know more about my humanistic perspective, just ask me. You're clearly uneducated. So instead of talking out of your ass, why don't you just fucking ask me what the nature of my humanism? I completely have railed against abstract humanistic universalism, human rights, and all that kind of stuff. I always fucking critique that regularly. I don't have some kind of fucking modern European humanistic perspective. I don't think Hegel necessarily does either. What you're saying is completely fucking wrong, but that doesn't mean I don't think a distinction between humans and animals is justified, unless your argument is that Hegel's elevation of humanity is abstract and whatever. But that just proves you're not a fucking Hegelian, because Hegel makes it clear it's not. Hegel doesn't create some kind of abstract criterion for humanity against which the world is being measured. Hegel demonstrates why humans are different from animals through an imminent process of development, not through some kind of top-down thing.
Okay, Lewis, would you like to reply?
Yeah, so the Nazis positing a power structure as a justification of their position is exactly what Hegel argues against in the phenomenology and the philosophy of right in the master-slave dialectic. I mean, that's the whole point. Power doesn't justify itself. What justifies power is actually the expression of subjectivity, or the expression of the will. I mean, that's essentially the whole point. So saying like, all right, the Nazis say that they're superior, and so they have shown themselves to be, more considerable. No, that's exactly what Hegel's arguing against.
You got it wrong.
So like, no, I haven't got it wrong. Like, what you're and the thing is, I wouldn't be surprised if you agreed with that. No, wait, I'll let you speak, so you let me speak. I wouldn't be surprised if you agreed with a power structure where you say might makes right, and some sort of stupid notion in which right can be justified through the acquisition of material or power. Right is not justified in relation to some sort of control or ideological manipulation. It's justified against reality, which is why reflection, which is why the essence is reflection, but the concrete foundation is the existence.
All right, we're going to move to the next question before this turns into a wedding. This is from Angela Marnie again for both of you. Quick. Oh, please go for it.
Yeah, okay. The imminent I'm not saying they're justifying themselves on the basis of power perspective. Maybe the power proves something imminent, but I'm not saying it's coming just from the fact they have power. Maybe what the Nazis would say is that our power attests to this fact, not necessarily that it is what proves it. So it's a complete straw man. You still haven't distinguished yourself.
Then I would accuse them of being tautological. They are saying might makes right. They're saying that
no, they're not necessarily.
I am more powerful, and what we are considering.
No. They're saying they might say that might attest to right, but they're not saying it's actually what makes right. It's a very, very
Well, they
clear
are, because they're
distinction.
saying that the power within nature is what determines rightness. So it's
No,
like
they're
saying,
not.
like,
They're not saying that.
yes, they are. They're saying
They're-
the
they're-
attestment of
no,
power
they are.
is
Lewis,
the,
Lewis, you're not.
Hey,
a great moderator.
hang on. Has, then Lewis.
Okay, Lewis, I'm not. They're not saying it's what actually determines right. It's just that from our perspective of finite knowledge, this is what demonstrates it for us, but it's not imminently what actually proves it. It merely attests to it. There's a operative distinction there. You seem to be unaware of the distinction I'm trying to make.
I'm actually very aware of the distinction you're trying to
Okay.
make, but the foundation from which they are pointing to, in which is this justification,
I didn't
is
speak of
again,
justification. I did not
Hang on,
speak of
has
justification.
let him finish, then reply.
this attestment, as you call it, towards reality is an attestment towards their power. They're saying that their actions within the world are somehow justifying their actions within the world.
No.
That is exactly
No.
against the Hegelian position.
No one mentioned justification. No one mentioned justification. No one mentioned justification, Lewis.
Okay.
Please.
Let us finish. So the whole point of the Hegelian system is to recognize that what is valuable is the will itself. It's not like some sort of like other predicate. It is.
Wait, do you think? Okay. Do you think Hegel's philosophy is some kind of like normative system?
Well, I think there is a normativity in Hegel. Like, of course.
Okay, yeah, that's extremely vague. Obviously, there's a normativity in Hegel.
Yeah, but like, so you're the one
you
being
think
vague.
it's a
What do you mean?
you think it's a normative system, not a philosophy?
Oh no, of course I think that it's more than normative. That would be ridiculous.
Okay, the answer, Lewis, is that it's not a normative system. Okay, so
I
it's
said
not
that
about,
it wasn't, and then you laugh and say
but
that the answer.
you're treating it
what
like
I
it
just
is.
gave
You're treating it like
was-
if I say that the Nazis are coming from are understanding themselves from a perspective of actual idealism, that's very different from saying they're using Hegel to justify themselves normatively.
The point what I was making is that the ontology from which they are saying is justifying their superiority.
Where does justification factor?
Hang on, let him finish.
Is their supposed superiority?
Sure,
The whole point in the Hegelian system is that the master and the slave, regardless of any hierarchization, are mutually dependent beings trying to express subjectivity. That is all that matters. Their interests.
That's fine.
Okay,
that's fine. First of all, it has nothing to do with the point. Where did I mention justification, and where could justification possibly factor into the point I'm trying to make?
Unless you weren't saying that a testament was a notion of trying to prove something.
No.
So you were just saying that it might possibly indicate.
Yes, that's exactly what I was saying, Lewis. If you were listening.
So they're just making unjustified assumptions then, and I can accuse them of that.
Wait. What do you mean?
Because justification's important. Like, do you deny the need?
I'm saying that they are interpreting their actions from the perspective of actualizing the will within this greater harmony of spirit. I'm talking. This is not my view of Hegel. This is your view of this actualistic view of
anything.
Hegel.
This is your attempts to try and paint me as a fascist because you're incapable.
No, okay. To be clear for the audience, Lewis is obviously not a fascist. I'm just saying that your philosophical views are uncannily close to actual idealism.
I very much. Well, I don't actually saying that. I'll read Giovanni and I'll make a distinction as to why they're different. But I will say that the logical end of my philosophy does not attest or does not in any way give credence to fascism.
Okay, well, it's going to be awesome when we have a prospective fascist in the next debate.
I perspective. To be clear, I agree that you don't want it to lead to fascism and you don't want it to. So I agree with that. You don't want to be a fascist, obviously. But do you have a choice is a question. If you take it to the end.
There's an apropos question here by Angela Marney. I take it to be addressed to perspective philosophy, but I'll let you both answer. But Lewis first. Does absolute knowledge mean no hierarchy between human beings or between beings?
It depends on what you point towards hierarchization. It would mean equal consideration of interests, uniformity. But in terms of we were all subject under right. But if we were to create, let's say, it would be more of like a hierarchy. You would still expect some form of normativity, or maybe not actually, because he does say that subjects reconcile themselves with the world. So probably not. Probably no hierarchy. But our actions would attest to the greatest expression of right. So, for example, if the greatest expression of right was the consideration of one interest over another in a particular scenario, we would all agree. That would be absolute knowing. We would all go, absolutely, it is our duty to do X, and that duty is the one that we will follow.
It logically follows very clearly from Hegel's view of absolute knowledge and his philosophy in general that Hegel does explain why the hierarchies in reality exist. And Hegel does believe, in my view, that hierarchies are an inevitability of the discontinuities in reality that exist objectively. So, for example, Hegel doesn't believe in hierarchy in the sense that he believes like a person is ontologically superior to another person, or a person is superior by virtue of some kind of characteristic. But for Hegel, there are necessary hierarchies in, for example, a society that represent the different positions of human beings in relation to the spirit and in relation to the state in particular. So in that sense, yes, hierarchies are implied for Hegel, but they're not. There's no. I don't think Hegel believes in an ontological hierarchy between human beings. I think Hegel immanentizes hierarchies as the relationship between the individual human and spirit in the form of the state.
If by that you mean that Hegel like thinks that hierarchies are necessary in order to express absolute spirit to its greatest possible degree, I wouldn't disagree necessarily, although the top of the hierarchy is absent of any subjectivity, which is why the king is just an empty subject. He fulfills the will of the people.
Well, it's not just the king. For Hegel, there's the civil servants, and there's all sorts of officials that stand above society.
Well, yeah, but the civil servants, what they're actually, I mean, there is like, it's not that it stands above society. It's that they are society mediating itself. So you've got like civil servants who are bureaucrats, and then you've got private society, and then you've got like these are three poles which are constantly interlocked to
but in common sense terms, that implies some people have more power than other people, and ergo, in the common sense, they're higher on the hierarchy.
Well, I mean, I would probably push back on that and say that power is in and of itself an expression of spirit and not an expression of individuality.
Okay, so sure, but there's hierarchy. Okay, just common sense. There's hierarchy. Okay.
Yeah, but I think that's making Hegel like essentially saying nothing of what he's actually saying. That would be like justifying like individualism rather than.
Well, no, because you're not addressing the person's question. The person is asking from a common sense perspective, like, would there be hierarchy? Like as we know it, hierarchy is in. Yes,
it's hierarchy of consideration versus hierarchy of.
You know what you sound like? You sound like George Orwell in the Animal Farm, and they go, "Some are more equal than others." Like, okay, yeah, in reality, it's a hierarchy. Okay, like you can justify it however you want, but yeah, that's a hierarchy.
One person does not get more than another. That doesn't happen.
Well, no, yes, I mean they do.
No, but that's not what he's justifying. He's not saying that one should get more than another.
No, he's not, but he's saying that they do.
Exactly what he's trying.
Because Hegel, his philosophy is right, is not a normative, prescriptive normative document. He's describing the way in which spirit is mediated in the form of the state to individual human beings, and hierarchy is a necessary part of that.
We'll just leave it there.
Yeah, we'll move to the next question. This is an interesting one for Haz from Noah Watson. At what point in human evolution does the slaughter, and I'll extend this to mean just the use as we use animals, of proto-humans become unjustifiable?
I actually am very skeptical to this idea that like for example, a lot of people think Neanderthals were like proto-humans, but there's actually no scholarly consensus as far as archaic humans are concerned as actually being a different species. The second thing I would say, though, is that there's a reason why we don't slaughter like chimpanzees and gorillas and shit. I mean, I guess some tribes in Africa might or whatever, but we generally don't because they're too similar to us. And it's not necessarily because we're doing it from an ethical or moral perspective. It's just a normative one. It's like aesthetic taste. It's like, you know what I mean? Like this question of like how to absolutely justify this or that is like, if we don't absolutely justify it, then necessarily it will follow that our normative position to the world will be chaotic and scary. Well, that's not the Hegelian perspective. For Hegel, Our normative, our mores, customs, norms, and the things we consider from a common sense perspective to be like normal, that is actually not like completely arbitrary and chaotic. It is reconciled with the sphere of ethics and morality and stuff. So it's not, they're just not the same thing, is important to point out. They're not the same thing, but it's still rational and meaningful and stuff. It's not like people are just going to become cannibals unless we contrive some kind of like ethical system.
Okay, we're past the 2-hour mark, so I'm going to limit us to 2 more questions. Again, if anybody has questions, put an asterisk on either end so I can catch them in the chat, and we'll be ending off after those. This is another one for Haz from Seeking A. What would and I apologize if this is redundant. I vaguely remember seeing this question earlier. What would have to be true that would convince you that animals are conscious? And what about the argument from marginal cases?
Yeah, the thing that would be necessary for that to be proven to me is that animals would actually have to demonstrate to me by means of some kind of communication that they are conscious. Like they would have to actually like talk to me or something. I mean, like maybe they would have to do it in a language that I wouldn't immediately understand, but they would have to be capable of language, and they would have to be able to recognize a difference between subject and object.
But how would you respond, just quickly, how would you respond then to Levinas, where we talk about what comes before language as the primordial expression? So like communication, I mean, 80% of communication, 80% of communication is non-linguistic. Like most of it comes from, body language, vocal tone, or engagements with each other that are not, actually contained within the words. But
I just want to say, like how you're explaining this to Haz right now. Keep going.
Yeah, but actually the semantic content of the words. So when we talk about some forms of like communication, we can have communication which is not linguistic, which animals display in their resistance. They scream, they try to get away, they display acts of fear and terror, and in many ways are pleading to us. They act and call us to our own conscience.
Okay, that's like saying a tree makes you feel a certain way. They're calling it to your conscience. Okay, obviously language is not the same as like formal verbalized words. Language is not the same as words. Obviously there's forms of communication that fall within the criterion of language that are outside of formal language, so to speak, right? As far as this primordial language stuff is concerned, I'm a Lacanian, so for me, this is the primordial basis of language is death drive, which animals do not possess. Animals do not possess the self-relating negativity.
The death drive that exists they do not have the death drive, but we have the death drive, and we can see that in their faces, which is why, as Zizek actually points out, that we see the death drive and our own monstrosity in the animals in which we saw that.
I understand. I understand the idea, like, language is something that emerged so nature could speak its own pain, whatever. But still, animals don't possess it, okay? They're not conscious. They are not themselves conscious. Maybe they...
possess it.
What?
So the make a display, which we would say was fundamentally a communication of...
No.
Pain.
No. There's a distinction between the communication that is proper to language and the elicitation of... the expression of some kind of contingent and external expression on part of the animal that evokes a certain stimuli to other animals. That is different from communication. Communication implies a withdrawnness of the subject with regard to themselves, so that things become for themselves to another, not just you need something like, for example, a big other. It's not just a one-way relation between me and then another person. It's that it's me, another person, and a fundamental third point of reference. That is the presupposition.
But the only way that occurs is in the acknowledgement of the other, and that acknowledgement of the other happens between us and animals in two ways. Animals do acknowledge us and engage with us.
So the acknowledgement...
Hang on, Lewis, quickly, and then Haz.
So one, animals do acknowledge and engage with us. Animals do, and I mean, like, shit, this is like unbelievably obvious in terms of training, in terms of like your ability to manifest a relationship with an animal. Animals definitely do, and they'll act even defensively, even with each other. Animals form social pacts. They're not in like a society or something like that, but they do have relationships with one another. It's not purely from like an internal standpoint. And then also they do communicate pain in that respect. They try and communicate their pain in the sense to make you stop. They try to communicate pain within a sense to cower from you and act defensively in order to make it end. Like cats will lie on their belly and show submission.
Okay. Concise, like 2 examples, not 10. Go.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. But like animals submit to each other. Even there is an active power relationship within animality.
Okay, has.
Okay, the first thing what you do is that you go like 5,000 different points. When I have 1 point, I want to stick to 1 point. So let's go one by one. There's 3 I could identify. The first point with regarding to the fact that a big other, the third term, is created only by a relationship with another person. Actually, that's not true. This third term is necessary both for the acknowledgement of another and ourselves. So that dialectic relationship is always there. Just by having a relationship to an other, you do not establish that third term. That is the third point of reference between you both. Okay, it's very important to understand. Okay, well, I'm addressing the point one by one.
Hang on.
You fucking shit out so many stupid fucking points.
A.
Okay, the second thing is you said that animals do in fact communicate to us and do relate to us. They don't do this any more than a fucking plant does. Okay, you haven't established how it's different from a plant. Okay, you haven't gotten from in itself to for itself as far as that's concerned. The third thing is that you said that animals communicate pain and all these kinds of things. Well, that's just anthropomorphization. It's like a cat lady who tries to intuit the feelings of her cat. Ultimately, there's a complete unbridgeable difference there where you could not possibly have communication with an animal because the third term that is the reference point of communication could not exist between you. So and as far as animal training and stuff is concerned, even though I don't myself take this view from a Hegelian perspective and classically modern European perspective, you still don't establish the difference between in itself and for itself. For example, what separates a robot from an animal in this regard? A complete just robot, a machine that can be trained and so on and so on. I mean, like you don't actually arrive at the point at which animals are conscious or have language.
All right, okay, so the third term in the Hegelian and Lacanian kind of, especially in the Lacanian sense, like the big other that's produced, that's not immanent within our being. That's produced from the relationship with the other, which then produces a notion of self, and that is self-consciousness, which is what happens at the mirror stage and the production of language. So that's not that's the production of language, not the necessary tenets of language which animals have. So
no.
The recognition. So
hang on.
So the recognition of consciousness is what produces language and allows us to formulate the third term. It's not what gives us consciousness. It's not already.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, thank you, Lewis. And now Hazen, you can respond.
Yeah, you make the same mistake in regards to Lacan that you did with Hegel. So when Hegel's talking about the mirror stage, you're again confusing this with Lacan's ontological claims and the implications, which are again being developed from the end. Yes, the truth of the beginning is again same with Lacan revealed at the end. So yes, and the very beginning, the distinction of the big other is there. The reason why Lacan moves to the big other is because of the inadequacy of the relation between one and another to possibly explain what gives rise to identity and subjectivity. Lacan moves to the big other because the initial thing is inadequate. It's literally the same as Hegel, but you make the same mistake and misunderstanding.
Okay, Lewis?
The big other could not possibly be there, because if it was there, then we would start with the barred subject and not the subject, which is exactly why Lacan starts with the subject, which is not barred by language, and at the production of language becomes barred.
So
that's the relationship with the big other.
Right.
And
you're
it's
making
the
the same.
with the self.
Okay, Lewis, can you please respond to my point, though?
I did respond to your point.
No, you didn't.
There. He
No,
moved.
Has restate the point. Lewis,
I'll restate the point, sure. Lewis, there's a difference between Lacan is not saying this is ontologically the case. He's saying this for purposes of his investigation, for purposes of his development of what is already there. So yes, the big other, in a sense, is already there. It's just that we don't know this, so to speak, at the beginning. It has to develop in a certain way in order to arrive at it. But yes, the big other is there.
Okay, Lewis.
The big other isn't a thing. It's a relationship.
Yeah, okay. Listen, the big other is the relationship, but the symbolic. It's the relationship of the symbolic order to the subject mediated by the imaginary. That's just what the big other means. That's all it means. And the symbolic order is something that Lacan believes as ontologically antecedent in the form of death drive.
I would agree that the death drive is there. We could agree on that, but that's separate. That's like saying like the will seeks to destroy. That's the will's frustration with itself.
Do you know why it's especially true that the symbolic order is already there, Lewis?
Well, it's
Because when you're an infant, it's literally there. Like you're born into a society, into a symbolic order, and you're just confused about your relationship to it. It's already there.
Exactly against what he argues, because he even talks about how erogenous zones don't even develop until past the mirror stage. So even our experience of pleasure hasn't even been sublimated in a way that makes sense.
But
so
the presence of the symbolic
hang
order.
on, has let him finish his response. Lewis, try to be concise. Go.
Yeah, so sublimation and the symbolic, the symbolization of our drives is past the mirror stage, which allows us to feel things in different locations and understand them in that way.
Yeah, but Lacan is not a stagist. He doesn't believe like these are just different stages. Lacan's own mirror stage, that was almost an epistemic development on his part to arrive at where he would eventually become. He doesn't actually ontologize these stages and say that this is actually imminently an ontological stage in being.
I don't know if I can kind of say this in another way. Like the whole point of the mirror stage is to recognize something that you did not see before. Like prior to that, consciousness was not aware of itself.
We know. What is leading the process along is the symbolic order.
Desire and the frustration of desire.
Well, but desire, again, what is leading desire along?
Nothing.
No, yeah, there is something.
What?
Drive.
That is desire.
No, it's not. Desire is not the same as drive, dude. I've studied Lacan for like 5 years. You don't know what you're talking about. Desire is not the same as drive. Desire is the imaginary form drive takes. Drive belongs to the domain of the real. Desire belongs to the domain of the imaginary.
Yeah, okay, if you want to say...
You don't know what you're talking about, dude.
If you want to say...
wasting my time.
Hang on. Let him respond, Hez.
If you want to say that what you mean by desire is the symbolized drive, fair enough.
It's not symbolized drive.
Yes, it is.
No, it belongs to the imaginary.
It's the sublimated drive.
Symbolized drive is signifier. Okay,
it's the sublimated drive, man. It's that simple. It's the drive which is given content so that it can be expressed
in the imaginary form.
Well, yes, but in so much that it gives the capacity for the will to actually express itself. Otherwise, it would
no. This is not philosophy. So he's not talking about will or any of this other stuff. He's talking about psychoanalysis. Okay, you have to know what you're talking about. But you just don't. You're not well read on Lacan.
Definitely is philosophical, since Lacan was heavily inspired by Hegel.
Lacan was inspired by Hegel's dialectic, but Lacan even would say this is just dialectical materialism. Like, it's not even Hegel per se.
Oh, no, like Lacan is not a materialist.
Let me ask you a question. When Lacan was confronted with the possibility of a certain theoretical position, he said, no, this can't be true because it would violate dialectical materialism. So yes, he was. But Lacan explicitly, even if you reject history and the facts, which you are, Lacan actually explicitly rejected the entire enterprise of philosophy. He contrasted psychoanalysis with philosophy as a completely separate enterprise. So no, Lacan does not think this is all philosophy. It's not philosophy.
Philosophical readings of Lacan are separate from Lacan himself anyway. Like, that's separate.
But even Zizek and Badiou have to critique Lacan's view of philosophy because they disagree with it.
That's fair enough. That's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that I don't think that Lacan is a materialist. Like,
you don't think Lacan said he is.
I would argue. I would certainly argue that the whole point of sublimation is to reconcile an individual's relationship with their drives to actually understand material in the world. Without such knowledge, you would be assuming that they would have those drives and just seek to express them.
Where does Lacan...
A lot of Marxists do.
Hang on, let him finish. Lewis,
talk
finish.
About Marxism now, though. Can we stick on topic?
Dialectical materialism. I'm not going to not mention the man.
Because let's just take it. Is Lacan a materialist? Yes or no? That's the topic.
I would say no.
The content. Okay. Well, the way you've justified that is because you've said that Lacan is making a philosophical claim about knowledge that's incompatible with materialism, but Lacan is making no such claim in the first place. And Lacan himself believes that he is engaging in a materialist enterprise. He himself does.
Okay. I would say that Lacan begins from a position which unifies the real, the signified, and the imaginary, and one such notion in that is immaterial, and without such, Lacan wouldn't make sense.
Well, what? No, material is not the same as substantial. It's clearly material in the sense of it's possessing a material content.
Do you think that the imagination is material?
When did I say that? The
Well,
relationship Lacan establishes between the imaginary, symbolic, and the real precisely is precisely materialist. That's like saying, go on, let me finish. That's like saying, if Marx acknowledges ideas, does that mean he thinks ideas are material? Well, no, ideas are not themselves material. You can be a materialist while acknowledging the reality of ideas. You can be a materialist while acknowledging the reality of the imaginary.
You would have to either explain you'd either have to explain the ideas in material terms or the material in ideal terms. That would be what would separate
what does material mean for you?
Okay, hang on, let him finish his point, and then you can respond.
So, in other words, I would say that Marx is very well aware of the of ideology and how it impacts our relationship with material. But it's all explained by moving through material, as in the material explains the ideas. Well, in Hegel, the ideas explain the material.
Okay, what is material? What do you mean by material?
Do you mean as in what do I mean by material, personally?
Yeah, what are you trying to say when you say Lacan he's not a materialist? What is material then?
I would say
the material thing.
I would say that material would be the I'd probably say determinate matter in terms of our experiences.
What is matter?
I would say the external reality.
Okay, sure. Matter for you is just external reality. Do I have you clear?
I would say that it's. I mean, not for me personally. I would say that what matter is actually a relationship. But I mean, in terms of I would say that matter in terms of how we understand it. I'd say that matter is actually an emptiness, which is kind of what Hegel would kind of point towards. Matter as formless, right?
Of course.
So
we know Hegel's view of matter is negative.
Okay,
so let's be clear. So Lacan is a materialist because for Lacan, the imaginary cannot possibly be self-referential. What defines the imaginary, just like what defines ideology for Marx, is in the form of symptoms in the real. Symptoms in the real for Lacan, which is a fundamental structure. It's a fundamental formation that subsists in the real, which accounts for the range of our imaginary forms. So for Lacan is clearly a materialist.
But Lacan believes symptoms.
Lacan does not have an undialectical view of materialism, according to which there's an underlying substance that determines the form and content of the superstructure, the imaginary or ideas. Obviously, that's an undialectical materialism. That's a straw man. No dialectical materialist believes that. Dialectical materialists understand that matter is a dialectic. Is dialectical. Matter is itself the unity of opposites. It's compatible with Mao's view of the drawing from Chinese philosophy of the unity of opposites as being matter itself. So matter has no form outside of the actual form given to it in the form of the imaginary and so on, but it is still primary. It is the primary content of that form. Lacan explains this. One last thing. Lacan actually explains this logic in the form of his concept of the non-all. It is all, yes, but there's the non-all makes it so that it is internally incomplete and contradictory, and there lies the primacy of matter. He doesn't say matter is a ready-made form that determines everything. Matter is itself something that exists in relation and disturbs in the form of symptoms, the imaginary forms, and it's primary because it is its real being.
Well, I think that the important thing to recognize, I think that I would not accuse Lacan of being anything but a phenomenologist, to be entirely honest with you. I don't think that we live in unmediated matter. That is exactly so otherwise, one, I think the way that you described materialism there, I'm gonna ask you to define matter as well. Because you described materialism in such a way that it almost included Hegel, which is so strange. The idea of a primacy of reality that we are subject to. Hegel agrees with that, but he's not a materialist. He doesn't see that reality as through material notion or physical notion. He sees it through he sees the material as being posited as an understanding of something.
Okay.
And this is exactly the same as the Lacanian point of the real, which is infinitely negative and resists meaning.
No, but here's what you don't understand. The real for Lacan is not only negative. The real actually has determinate form in the form of symptoms. The real is not simply negativity for Lacan. And that's actually the primary form of, that's the primary distinction as far as dialectical materialism with Hegel's idealist philosophy is concerned. It obviously, there's an agreement with Hegel as far as the fact of there being a dialectic relation between form and content. That much is very clear. But from the materialist perspective, it is precisely content, material essence, and being which reconciles the form. In other words, the truth of the form is in the material. It subsists in material being itself already. This explains, for example, Marx's elevation of the proletariat as the class. I don't want to get into that, but
I would. Well,
okay. We can. I can
has finished, and then you can go, Lewis.
We don't have time. I don't want to diverge into other topics. That's why. So for Lacan, matter is. So if you want to ask me the question of how I would define matter, I would define matter in a very similar way that pre-modern philosophers in the past would define like essence and content. Matter does not self-subsist in an undialectical way, in an unmediated way, as you're trying to say. That's undialectical. That's actually not materialist. It's substantialist, and it ultimately leads to the conclusion of idealism, which was Marx and Engels' criticism of French materialism in the first place. Matter is definitely mediated, but that doesn't change that matter is primary and that matter is antecedent. Matter is contained in the word itself. It is the matter, the real content, the real content of any given totality. Necessarily comes at the expense of both our knowledge and the form given to this content. That's the point of dialectical materialism. It is describing a relationship between form and content. That
okay, I'm going to
form arises from content, but not in a way that is all contained in the form itself. The content is latent with the birth, regeneration, and destruction of existing forms.
Okay, I'm going to allow one more response from both of you. No interruptions, please. Lewis, then Has.
I don't necessarily even disagree with pretty much anything you've said. It's just whether you would give matter the primacy of that. It's like whether you would say that the real is matter. I don't think that Lacan, well, at least in my understanding of Lacan, I suppose I could be wrong, I wouldn't have said that Lacan would give that primacy to matter. He would have gave the real, like, it's not that he would say that what is real is this external physical existence which we are being tested against. Instead, actually, this internal existence that we are experiencing is already the symbolic. We experience the symbolic reality. We don't experience the real. The real manifests itself in the inadequacy of this symbolic realm and in our internal understanding of self. Like the real is existence itself and our place within it and how we are symbolizing it, which is why it's phenomenological, at least from my interpretations of things. If you want to say that it's matter, I mean, I would have to do more reading to just go fundamentally 100% Lacan is saying that the real is matter. But I do not think that I've ever come across anyone saying that the real is matter, and that rather anything else, that what the real is anything but what is, which is what makes it infinitely negative. You can't predicate anything of it. You can't say that there is an essence of it other than, because essence is actually in the symbol. It is in the production of essence that we get the symbolized reality. Like the imagination produces an essence from which is applied to reality in the form of a symbol, which is mediated through the self and the other.
Okay, two things. The real is not matter. I didn't say that. It's just that the real occupies a similar relation to both the symbolic and the imaginary that matter does to ideas as relevant to philosophy. That's why Lacan is a materialist. And obviously, materialism for Marx implies the destruction of philosophy, which Lacan is committed to in the form of psychoanalysis itself. So in that sense, the real and matter are related. The real and matter are related because the real is the precise way in which matter relates to us psychologically, but it's not identical with matter itself, obviously.
I don't think that Lacan is, if I may, I will say, I don't think that Lacan, like the primary, like the importance of,
I'll get to it. Yeah, I'll get to it. Lacan obviously doesn't draw like a Kantian distinction between psychology and reality, but what I was just trying to simplify that the real is matter insofar as it relates to our like psychological reality or whatever, because there is clearly a discontinuity, but that discontinuity is ontologically accounted for. For example, in Zizek's work, the discontinuity between, for example, symptoms in the unconscious, in the symbolic order, and I'm going to get to that, it's going to be my second point, and symptoms in nature. There are symptoms in nature that you can understand ontologically, and then there are symptoms relevant for the unconscious. There is no hard Kantian distinction between these two, but there's still a discontinuity, and that discontinuity is the very object of Zizek's ontological enterprise, which I disagree with a lot, but I'm just saying, acknowledging that the discontinuity exists is not a Kantian thing. And then the second thing you said is that the real is always already takes the form of the symbolic, but it seems like you're very confused about the actual content of the symbolic.
I didn't say that.
Hang on, Lewis. It has his turn.
Okay, whatever you said about the relationship between the real and the symbolic. Okay, this is what you need to understand. The symbolic is precisely, I would argue, material. Actually, the symbolic is precisely material in regards to the imaginary. Signifiers are symptoms for Lacan. This is the conclusion of Lacan's work. Signifiers are not produced as they're not philosophical concepts. It's very easy to mistake signifiers for concepts. They are not the same thing. Signifiers are symptoms of the unconscious, and they are formed in a way that comes at the expense of our conscious conceptual imaginary form. So for Lacan, the concept belongs to the realm of the imaginary. For example, it is not something that premises the imaginary itself.
Well, I guess this is what I would have said. I wasn't saying that that we already exist in the symbolized. I mean, in a thrownness and maybe like a Heideggerian sense, perhaps, but not like in a already the world is simply given to us symbolized. Quite the opposite. I was saying that we gain symbolization through an active process of imagination, which is mediated between two parties.
But for Lacan, that's not the case.
Well, I think it is the case.
No. For Lacan, the imaginary has a very passive role in relationship to the symbolic and the real.
But we can get into that, and you know, I'm happy to. I do need to go and research Lacan more, but from my understanding of Lacan, this is where I've taken it. The real isn't seen as material; it's seen as the absence of any given thing. The symbolic would contain material, but it wouldn't be limited to material. It would be anything which would be given determinate existence. So I'd be like,
which for Lacan is material. Determinate existence is material for Lacan.
Well, that's like a point of contention of whether it is or not. Like, I don't know. I'll definitely check.
Okay, you don't know. Fine.
But, no, I'll definitely check. From my understanding, it's phenomenological because it contains the mediation of what is it is a mediated reality through thought. It is the production.
No, not thought.
All right,
no.
I think we're going to move on to the next question now, and we're going to make this the final question. And this is from Einzelganger, and I'm going to address this to both of you. Leaving aside the previous argument about the consciousness of animals, please comment upon the argument that veganism is necessary for the sake of the environment insofar as it is able to sustain human beings into perpetuity. Who wants to go first?
I have to. Can I go and then can I go pee? Because I got to pee really bad.
If you guys want to take 2 seconds to do that right now, you can.
I'm gonna go pee. I'm very bad.
Yeah, you do that. Hang on, Lewis. We'll wait till he gets back.
No problem. No problem.
My bladder is stoically shut.
Yeah, I'm just gonna. As soon as this is over, I'm running to the bathroom. To be entirely honest with you,
You've got time. Why don't you do that now?
No, I'm happy to wait. I'd rather be able to take my time and feel like this is like you want to really savor that release. I got you. That's the thing. It's almost like it's gonna be cathartic. It's gonna be like that will be symbolic.
Hey, by the way, I've been meaning to ask, where did you get that jellyfish lamp behind you? I want one.
My girlfriend got us it, so I'll ask her. I'll ask her. But I'm a big fan of the jellyfish lamp. I've had loads of people ask if they're real jellyfish now, which I don't know. Half of them I think are taking the piss, and then the other half, like, I think are serious, because there's even people like.
Well, how do they work?
So like this is the thing, right? So that's water, right?
Yeah.
Like so you get this like filled like empty, and you get those little like jellyfish like plastic things, and then you put the water in, like you fill it up yourself, put a couple of drops of like dishwashing, like dish soap, and then like once you put it on, like there's a light at the bottom and like a motor or whatever, or pump rather. So like it's pumping water up, that's making it like circulate.
Okay.
And there's a light at the bottom, so like, and then you've got a remote that can like, so like.
So the jellyfish themselves, they have, there's nothing moving in them. They're just being pushed around. All right,
Yeah.
Haz is back. We're gonna get back to this. So I'm just gonna restate the question. Haz, I don't know if you can hear me yet.
I can hear you.
You're good? Brilliant. Okay. So again, please comment upon the argument that veganism is required to sustain the environment for humanity. Who would like to go first?
I will if
Please.
there's no objection. Okay, sure. Yeah, I don't think it is. There's two things, right? First, to say it's necessary means it's necessary from the perspective of some kind of subjective agent. Well, the first problem with that is that you're including in your necessity something that may not necessarily be possible. For example, the commitment human beings have in this world to eating meat is not simply a result of a deficient ethical or moral system on their part, but could itself be somehow part of our objective reality, changing our very notion of necessity. The necessity implies that we can actually force people or convince people to stop eating meat, but that is not necessarily true. It's not necessarily true you can convince everyone to stop eating meat, so you have to change the object. You have to change the content of what your necessity is based on the necessities of, based on being, based on reality. Now, the second thing is that I actually don't believe it's true. I'm going to do three things. The second thing is that I don't believe it's necessarily true that meat consumption has to end in order to stop climate change. Maybe there's a level of wasteful meat production that's harmful to the environment that has to be curbed down, but I don't think it implies anything about stopping climate change. The third thing is that there's an assumption that climate change can even be stopped, and I actually don't think that much is very clear. I don't know if we can stop climate change. I'm not really inclined to believe we can stop it. I think we're entering a new era in which humanity will have to adjust to this new reality and reconcile itself with the way it which has, in a way that it did not choose to or will to, changed the world. So I believe in a deeper reconciliation of this fact of having changed the world in a way we didn't expect or know, as something actually which will turn out to be rational. So that's my 3 points.
Okay, Lewis.
Yeah. So could you just do us a favor, just restate the question so that I make sure that I can answer it concisely. I do my best to anyway.
Yeah, no worries. Sure. Comment upon the argument that leaving aside the issue of the consciousness of animals and all that ethical stuff, veganism is required to preserve the environment for human beings.
Okay. So obviously I do think animal lives matter and so on. And I do think that all behavior is malleable from an existentialist position. In theory, everything can change about the way we act. We can radically reinvent ourselves and change the way we act in our relationship with nature, specifically energy production and food production. With animal agriculture, there is a real big issue in terms of deforestation, primarily, and also the production of methane. So what we have is a relationship in which we need to radically reduce meat consumption, meat, dairy, and egg consumption in order to save our planet. And I mean, that would mean taking away the number one cause of deforestation, for example, which is animal agriculture. It would also mean taking away the number one cause of ocean dead zones, which is animal agriculture. It would mean taking away the number one cause of ocean plastics, the number one cause of river pollution. So, and then also 28% of greenhouse gas emissions, and that was a study done by Oxford, and also 70% of our land use is coming from animal agriculture. So in terms of animal agriculture's environmental impacts, even towards the human habitat, it is profound. We need to reimagine our relationship with our food supply and move towards a plant-based diet, even for a matter of self-preservation. And then to add to that, We haven't even considered the risk of zoonotic diseases, which are a massive existential threat. COVID-19 being only a tiny, shitty little, like really flu compared to what can happen when we look at things like Ebola, or when we look at things like even H1N1 and H5N1. These flus would have been absolutely devastating had they had the virulency. There would have been a massive existential threat for our own survival. And then even in terms of how we treat others, if we look at something like the slaughterhouse is indicative of an environment which is unsuitable for human engagement. It is a house of horrors, and individuals come out with what is called PITS disorder, perpetration-induced traumatic stress. This is a manifestation of trauma. People have feelings of disintegration, feelings of paranoia, drug addiction, alcohol abuse, and are much more likely to engage in domestic violence and violence against other humans as well, which is documented pretty clearly in the point that we can actually show that arrests.
Isn't this beyond the question?
Well, it's anthropomorphic value, isn't it, in relation to animal agriculture? So
it was about the environment.
Okay, hang on. Try to wrap it up, Lewis, and then we'll move on to final statements.
So in terms of the size of a slaughterhouse facility, we can actually map on domestic violence and violence as a whole to the size of the facility. So if you care about humans and you want to protect us against habitat destruction and even protect us against ourselves from the production of zoonotic disease and even manifesting violence, then yeah, go plant-based.
That's a really stupid argument.
I've got evidence of you.
I mean, no, you said a lot of things, but like the idea that if you want to stop domestic violence more, dude, the reason why we have domestic violence, the reason why the harm toward animals evokes feelings of domestic violence is because of a more underlying problem in the first place. It doesn't necessarily follow that, factory farms and slaughterhouses will lead to domestic violence. It's just that they do that given the current circumstances of the relationship between men and women in our society. Like, what you're saying is like really stupid.
Well, actually, the authors posit the fact that women and children are usually seen as vulnerable as are animals. So the relationship between vulnerability is what is producing the domestic violence.
Yeah, well, it's a cycle. Well, that state of vulnerability that women and children are in is also societal. It's also resulting from the fact that women and children are not given adequate protection in our society. And also the fact that women and children are women in particular are objects of male violence, and it's a more deeper problem than just animals.
Oh, I agree. It's a much deeper problem overall societally, but I think that it's certainly feeding into a problem. And also the vulnerability that is manifest in children is probably not something that we could just miraculously change.
No, I'm not even saying you can change it for women. Well, no, women are weaker than men. I'm not even saying you can change it for women. I'm just saying that the violence against women in particular doesn't simply follow from seeing animals being killed. It follows from seeing animals being killed plus a society with a specific relationship between men and women.
But that's also only the manifestation of that aggression. That's the way it's sublimating. So it would sublimate in a self-destructive way regardless, which is why the ones who don't commit...
How can you prove that? You can't prove that.
Because many of them report feelings of disintegration, insomnia, alcoholism, drug abuse, much higher conviction rates. So it manifests itself and sublimates in various different ways.
I can't check the studies and data, so I'm just going to assume it's correct. That's what I usually do when I can't verify a source. But even if we assume that's correct, it doesn't actually follow that is the true cause.
Well, I mean, you can go into... I've got a video on it. It's called Working in Hell. You can go and have a look.
Okay, well, I think you should read Hegel before you recommend me videos.
All right, we're going to call it now. We're at 2 hours and 41 minutes, and I believe the Taliban are about to take Kabul. So I'll let you guys take 3 minutes each to make your final statements, and then we'll call it a night. Sound good?
Yeah.
All right. Haz, would you like to go first?
No, he can go first.
All right, Lewis?
Yeah, sure. So what Haz has demonstrated in this argument is his ignorance, to be entirely honest with you. He actually gave a better position in his first debate, which was essentially that the separation between animals and humans was one of epistemological difference, not ontological difference. In this debate, he's trying to make the ontological difference, which Hegel outright denies. He hasn't answered any of the questions I raised about ideology and why we are abstracting man to the form of consciousness, which is definitely against the Hegelian notion, at least from the perspective of someone who understands the system and not reading through the lens of what Hegel himself thought. So yeah, I've answered all of these questions, and I think now we just have to ask ourselves, what is the foundation of value in reality? Is it the notion of humanity? Is it is it a form of self-righteous consideration of something that is the form of Adam that is being bestowed upon us by man, or some sort of abstracted rational agent in a Kantian sense? Or is it something which is sensitive? Is it that the intellective capacities of a rational agent are based upon reflecting upon the sensitive nature of experience? We gain information which is good or bad immanently from reality. That information is what consciousness is, and that information exists in animals. And so when we do not consider that information, we are committing a philosophical failure. We are not considering what is actually right and what is actually valuable. We are considering what we want to be right and what we want to be valuable.
All right, thank you, Haz.
Yeah, I didn't catch all of that because I was ordering chicken shawarma sandwiches. I'm really hungry, but anyway, I'll conclude it with this. So I left the last debate. Last debate, I was really tired, and I didn't quite know for certain whether perspective philosophy actually understood Hegel or not. So in this debate, I actually wanted to take the opportunity to grill him and see if he actually could prove he knows what he's talking about. I have 100% confidence beyond any reasonable doubt whatsoever that perspective philosophy derives his understanding of Hegel entirely from his ass. And not only does he know nothing about Hegel, he also proved he doesn't know anything about Lacan and things like materialism and Marxism and a host of other subjects. Lewis says he's responded to all of my questions and I haven't responded to any of his, but the exact opposite is literally true. And I think anyone who reviews this debate in good faith will see that I did make a good effort to try and actually pin Lewis down and ask him concrete, simple questions, which he just dilly-dallied and danced around without ever directly addressing anything I raised. None of the points I raised were addressed by him or even acknowledged. He has a proclivity to go into tangents about completely irrelevant things that are meant to confuse the audience as well as me. I wasn't impressed by it. I can clearly map and trace through the course of receiving his arguments that A does not follow B, and that what the tangents he goes on are in no way connected to the actual underlying points that were under contention. So in conclusion, I think it's a pretty one-sided debate. I got what I was looking for. I've exposed perspective philosophy as a fake Hegelian, especially when he actually admitted that he doesn't actually think that Hegel believes in the unity of being and thought. And I think I've gotten more than I wanted to do, because all I wanted to do here was prove that perspective philosophy was a fake Hegelian who doesn't know shit about Hegel. But I also proved that he also doesn't know shit about Lacan either. So that was a freebie, Yeah, I think, I'm pretty satisfied with the result. I was pretty well rested, pretty alert today, unlike last time. So, I'm satisfied. I got what I wanted.
Just to quickly say, I definitely didn't say that Hegel said that being wasn't.
We had the chance to argue.
Says all there is.
Oh, you already had your closing statement. So.
Oh no, there is the thinking thing.
You already gave your closing statement.
And also, you never answered the infinite.
As is correct,
question.
Unfortunately, these were closing statements.
Fair enough.
We can if you guys want to do a rematch, give me a week or two so I can not die of blood clots. But we'll arrange that. But for now we're done. So thanks everybody for participating, and take care. Thank you again to audience questioners as well. Thank you, Haz. Thank you, Lewis. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.